April 18, 2016 ATB, Shishikasaku, Miyagi. 1232. Lieutenant Colonel Kusakabe Josui, of the Japanese Liberation Front, sat comfortably in Caesar, his knees protected from the traditional tatami of his formal office by an overstuffed pillow. Externally, he was stoic, properly joyless in accordance with the regulations inherited from the late and lamented Republican Japanese Army. Internally, a fierce tide of rising elation threatened to drown his firm demeanor in wild joy. The only thing truly holding Josui back from such a celebration was the messenger, who droned on monotonously as he read his report aloud. Despite the fact that the report could have simply been printed off and delivered to Josui, or even emailed to him, the JLF just like the RJA ran on tradition, and thus the mandatory report reading. It was a relic of times when a commander might not have been able to read, a relic of a time before standardized education and the radio. Thanks to that honorable tradition dating back who knew how many years, all reports sent to a staff officer were to be read aloud by the messenger to prevent any inadvertent public shaming. Like much of the JLF, it was practically useless in the face of modernity. But today, nothing, not his dark thoughts, not even the yammering of the messenger, could dent Josui's enthusiasm. Not in the face of the report's astonishing contents. Somehow, Anoda had managed to make good on his promise, and had proven once and for all that his previous successes weren't flukes. Not only had he managed to turn the pathetic group of Shinjuku rats that the 6 houses had dumped on them into a useful and expendable unit, Anoda had managed to deploy said rats effectively on the field of battle. In the process, the wily major had significantly raised the profile of Kusakabe's 3rd Division within the JLF, to say nothing of the other benefits his shoestring operation had yielded. For the meager price of some crates of cabbage and a few cheap anti-armor missiles, Anoda had purchased several hundred fresh recruits and an embarrassment of riches in the form of spare nightmare parts, energy fillers, and specialized tools. Not a bad return on investment, Josui chuckled to himself, as the sergeant continued with his reading. 110 replacement seal kits for /Harken systems, 500 meters of replacement /Harken cable, 50 replacement /Harken heads, 2 crates of bearings for the /Harken retraction motors, a box of heat shrink tubing for insulation repair. Enough. Despite his good mood, Josui's patience abruptly snapped. He had never been the most patient of men, and little wore through his meager supplies of tolerance quite like pointless formality or babbling subordinates. I'll read the rest on my own. Get to the radio room and relay the report to Narita HQ over the general band, and attach a message with my compliments for Colonel Todo's Chief of Staff. Make sure the phrase generous gift to the Nightmare Corps appears in the message. Go. The sergeant promptly saluted, but Josui had already forgotten the man as he eagerly flipped through his copy of the report. The first section had been transmitted from the outpost in eastern Nagano where Anoda's pet militia had dropped off their hijacked truck, and was mostly concerned with detailing the cargo's contents. The second, more interesting section, had come from Anoda. 4 nightmares and no casualties, eh? Josui mumbled aloud. It was, in a word, unbelievable, but Josui had known Anoda hero for 6 years, and had never known him to inflate his own successes. Or at least, not to do it so blatantly. So the report was probably accurate, which meant that Major Anoda had once again handed Josui and the rest of his faction more ammunition for the upcoming General Staff Summer Strategy meeting. And just in time too, that headache's only 2 weeks away now. General Kotase would be there, the doddering old fool, as would Colonel Todo, head of the Nightmare Corps and Kotase's heir apparent. The rest of the divisional commanders would also attend, along with their seconds, and at least one emissary from the 6 houses to make sure that Kyoto's views were represented. And of course, Kusakabe Josui would be in attendance as well, and unlike everybody else, except for the man from Kyoto, he had something substantive to bring to the table. There was, unfortunately, no way that Josui could justify holding onto the nightmare spare parts. Much as he would have liked to break Todo's monopoly over the JLF's scant nightmare forces, that wasn't going to happen, thanks to Todo's family history and his own personal reputation. Todo Kyo's hero had deep family connections to the military, going back through the Republican Japanese Army days through the Imperial Japanese Army, all the way back to the time of the Bafuku. Todo's father had served with distinction during the First Pacific War, and the younger Todo had been the personal arms master to the Kurorugi clan, including the prime minister and his family. More to the point, Todo had the much-touted miracle of Itsukushima, and the conventional wisdom was that the only man to beat nightmares with conventional forces was the best leader the JLF Nightmare Corps could hope for. Josui personally had his doubts on the matter. Despite, or perhaps because of, his impressive personal fighting skills, Todo was a living fossil. The man represented a deep well of Japanese military tradition, and lived like the samurai of old. Unfortunately, that made him incredibly hidebound, wedded to old thoughts and traditional concepts of honor. Honor, of course, had its place. That place was in a freed and refounded Republic of Japan. After the day of liberation had come and gone, Josui was encumbered by no such outmoded concepts, and had thus realized that they represented a critical vulnerability in the other man. Not only did the idea of honorable combat sound like a joke when the home islands were under the degrading occupation of a foreign empire, the need to be seen as honorable was easily exploited. Josui had, in fact, just exploited that sense of honor in the message he'd ordered attached to the report forwarded to the Narita headquarters of the JLF. By making the nightmare parts and tools into a freely given gift at Todo's command before General Kotase could make his views known, Josui had just put Todo into his personal debt under the old honor codes, while simultaneously undercutting Kotase's authority, the authority to which Todo was heir. Alone in his office, Josui permitted himself a grin of satisfaction. With this second victory under his faction's belt in less than a month, Kotase would be all but forced to commend him in front of the entire general staff. If he didn't, considering the lack of any other combat operations conducted recently, Kotase would be all but admitting that he hadn't authorized the operations, which would undermine his authority even further. The one lever Kotase could have used to cut Josui back down to size, redistributing his spoils, Josui had pulled himself before Kotase had even known it existed, disarming and redirecting the threat before it could be made. I'm almost looking forward to that damned meeting, just to see the old windbag's face. Josui's satisfaction was all too short-lived. Thinking about the leverage that he held over Kotase's head had inexorably brought his thoughts back around to the other headache, and the source of most of his ever-increasing gastric distress. While his power was now secure from threats from above or from his peers, Josui was acutely aware that a growing menace was developing below him, in the ranks of his own faction. Gekkoku was a sword that could cut both ways, and no superior was truly safe from a sufficiently motivated subordinate clever enough to find a way to dress up their insubordination as a rightful defense of true authority. And unfortunately, the man who had done more than anybody else to advance Josui's own campaign of rightful insubordination was the one best placed to plunge a knife into Josui's back if he so wished. Major Anoda hero. Anoda. Just thinking about the man made Josui grimace with discomfort. More than Todo, more than Kotase, Josui blamed Anoda for the slow growth of his ulcers. A graduate of the Nakano School of Military Intelligence, Anoda Hiro had served in the Special Operations Group before the conquest. Unlike most of the Republican Japanese Army, then Lieutenant Anoda had seen combat before the conquest, as a military attaché at the Japanese embassy in Hanoi. Taken together with his post-conquest service as an infiltrator and scout, not to mention sometimes assassin, Major Anoda was an invaluable subordinate, despite his thoroughly common family background. That plebeian origin, so different from Josui's own as a member of a minor noble clan, coupled with his apparently sincere loyalty, had made Anoda one of the most valuable officers in Josui's faction. It had been easy to mitigate the potential threat represented by Anoda to Josui's power base by assigning him to all the long-term, solitary missions Josui could find. Not only had this played to Anoda's skill set, it had kept him far away from headquarters, far away from any junior officers he could suborn with a carefully placed promise or threat. But now, that plan seemed to have slightly backfired. Anoda had parlayed his intended assignment into exile into operational independence, and in the process had created a power base entirely independent of the JLF. While Josui doubted that he had to worry about the direct threat of an assassination courtesy of Anoda's pack of strays, a potential homecoming could prove equally disastrous. If Anoda could ride the success of his victories in the field into a return to headquarters, he might bring some or all of his private army back with him. But he hasn't done anything yet. Josui heaved himself to his feet and made his way out of his official office. But that doesn't mean anything. The man's sharp as a knife, and famous for his patience. He's smart enough to play the long game. While it was Josui's officially listed post as the commander of the 3rd Division, the traditional room he had just left was more or less useless for anything but impressing underlings conveying messages. His actual office, sporting a thoroughly modern computer a mere 8 years old and complete with a connection to the internet the technical service had assured him was secure, was where the actual work got done. Unfortunately, sitting in his swiveling office chair behind said computer and staring at the Japanese flag hung behind the guest's chair did nothing to resolve Josui's dilemma. Anoda was, above all else, loyal to the cause of liberation from the shame of foreign occupation. His dedication to that task was beyond reproach, and his record of successful missions spoke to his ability to leverage that zeal to produce concrete results. He had no obvious vices, he drank only in moderation and never blabbered his secrets when in his cups. He had no interest in men, not that such interest was quite as useful of a secret as it once was. Likewise, while he was interested in women, his interest wasn't enough to overcome his rationality. Indeed, Anoda's only true passion seemed to be for the cause, and for shedding blood for the cause. Josui chuckled uneasily to himself, the collar of his uniform jacket wet with sweat, clammy in the room's stifling heat. How is it possible that an almost perfect subordinate is a bigger pain in my ass than the rest, huh? This was far from Josui's first time warding off threats from below. As the 3rd Division was General Kotase's preferred assignment for any overly aggressive or ambitious soldiers or officers, Josui felt confident that he had likely warded off more coup attempts than any other staff officer in the JLF. More often than not though, he had been able to pick the would-be usurpers off before their plans got off the ground. Suicidal missions for the incompetent, trumped-up courts-martial over various alleged crimes or dishonorable actions for the competent followed by unceremonious executions or disappearances. By virtue of his incredible competence and sterling reputation, Major Anoda Hero had effectively knocked both of Josui's best swords from his hand, and by building his own power base Anoda had dodged Josui's attempt to drive him into irrelevance and exile. Simply killing Anoda was far too risky. A bullet behind the ear would certainly solve this particular problem, but if someone learned about it and handed the information that he had executed a successful and productive subordinate without cause to Kotase or Todo, the balance of power in the JLF would swing definitively against Josui. It was unfortunate, but just like Todo and the nightmare supplies, Josui couldn't see any way around it. The fact of the matter was, he would have to wait until ironclad evidence of Anoda's schemes was found or manufactured. Well, if I can't punish him, Josui thought, scowling as he logged onto his computer and dutifully followed the written instructions to fire up the secure network connection provided by the bespectacled private from the technical service, entering the username and password the technician had helpfully added to the end of the instructions when prompted. I suppose I'll have to reward the bastard. Damn it. I can't promote him and money's tight enough as is. A formal notice of recognition, perhaps? Kusakabe Josui shook his head irritably. No. That's the last damn thing that man needs. More recognition among the rest of the division and they'll start wondering why he's not in charge. An idea struck Josui, and, smiling, he began to draft an email to his chief of staff. Anoda likes being independent, does he? Fine by me. He'll get an extension of duty, then. Let him keep fucking about with Shinjuku rats and rural bumpkins. I'll even increase his discretionary budget. And while he's busy screwing around in the backwoods of Gunma, I'll find everyone in the division with a positive word to say about the man and beat it out of them. Josui allowed himself a second satisfied grin as his fingers danced enthusiastically across the worn keyboard, content that his position was once again secure from enemies above and below. With the ammunition Anoda had provided, Josui would be able to take the fight to Kotase and Todo once more, until he finally had the power to force the JLF awake from its torpor. Anoda might even appreciate what I'm doing, Josui thought with amusement. After all, I too am fighting for the cause. Every day old man Kotase is in command, the day of liberation is one day further away, and Todo's almost as bad. If Japan is ever to be free again, we must have better leadership. Finally, content with the enthusiastic commendation that he had written to congratulate Major Anoda on his recent success and the attendant order to continue his mission until further notice, Josui hammered the send button, committing the email to the surprisingly labyrinthine bureaucracy that had somehow survived the conversion of the RJA into the JLF. Damned cockroaches survived the conquest, and they'll probably survive until the day of liberation itself. Not much longer after that, if I have my way. And on that topic, Josui turned to the battered and heavily annotated political and topographic map of Japan that hung on his office wall, just by the door and above the waste paper basket. The General Staff Summer Strategy meeting was of course supposedly concerned with lofty affairs of high strategy and the formulation of the next cunning stratagem to unleash against the hated foreigners, and it wouldn't do to show up without some form of proposal in hand. Although the proposed plans were ultimately more set-dressing than substance, openly acknowledging the farce would fatally undermine his hard-fought position. And now that the matter of internal politics had momentarily been dealt with, it was high time for the commander of the Third to figure out what his contribution to the sham meeting would be. Unlike the last few dozen such meetings, though, Josui felt like this time he might actually have a chance to force the issue. If I can call in that favor with Todo. Or even suggest that he take the field personally, the miracle worker of Itsukushima, April 21, 2016 ATB, Shinjuku Ghetto, Tokyo Settlement. 1550. 6 years ago, when my mother and I had been forced behind the freshly built walls encircling the Shinjuku Ghetto, I had dreamed of the day I would leave the massive prison our conquerors had built for us. Through the years of struggle, hunger, and sickness, I had dreamed of my past life, of soaring high above any wall built by human hands. I had dreamed of freedom, freedom from hunger, freedom from fear, freedom from the hollow-eyed gaze of men and women infected with the hopeless miasma of Shinjuku. Now, I was entering Shinjuku once again. As it had 6 years before, my randoseru hung low on my back, crammed to capacity with clothes and other supplies. As before, I lowered my head as I passed through the checkpoint into Shinjuku, my distinctively bright hair hidden under a rag. And as before, the scent of Shinjuku, a stew of clogged gutters, rotting garbage, feces, and too many people living in too small of a space, all simmering in the heat of the afternoon sun, rose up to greet me. The pistol butt pushing into my gut was, of course, a significant departure from that long-ago August day. Likewise, while my mother no longer trudged before me, bent under her own load of meager possessions and grief, Ogi now walked beside me, standing as tall as a Japanese man could in this land of 11s. Most importantly, I was not entering Shinjuku as a refugee. The times had changed, after 6 long years. While I still dreamed of freedom, I no longer dreamed of escape. Besides Ogi and myself, Nagata and 28 of the freshly trained insurgent fighters returned to Shinjuku the same way we had left it, in ones and twos, for the most part, merging with the crowds of returning day laborers and honorary Britannians coming to the Ghetto to indulge their vices. Tsubaki and the rest of Squad 2 were taking a slight detour on their way into Shinjuku, rendezvousing with one of Ino's Rising Sun trucks to load the weapons and equipment we had brought from the school. Despite the familiar stench, Shinjuku hadn't remained unchanged in my absence. The cheeks of passers-by seemed a touch less hollow, and their hair and skin somewhat more lustrous. People's eyes seemed brighter and more alert than I remembered, and most of the crowd walked purposefully and quickly, instead of the trudging Shinjuku shuffle. Fresh asphalt glistened under the sun from freshly filled-in potholes, tar still soft and sticky, and fresh whitewash unblemished by gang tags shone on tenement walls. And, while the cheap brothels and bars that clustered in the streets near the checkpoints were busy as always, even in the mid-afternoon, I noticed a lack of any obvious gangsters swaggering about the place. Even the pimps and the callers hustling for customers seemed more well-behaved than I remembered from my mother's time. Beside me, Ogi let out an impressed grunt, and I nodded in agreement as we walked. This slice of Shinjuku, just under a kilometer from Naoto and Ogi's shared apartment and a kilometer and a half from the Rising Sun's meeting house, while neither thriving nor prospering, looked significantly better off than it had mere months ago. As we turned off the road leading to the checkpoint and left the view of any curious Britannian soldier, Ogi turned to me and broke the silence, speaking with a slight smile. Naoto and Ino have been busy, I see. I hummed in agreement, somewhat distracted by my attempt to fish the handheld radio out of my randoseru. They've made a good start, no doubt about that. Finally, I felt the hard plastic shell of the radio and pulled it from its nest of clothes. And if we can keep up the momentum, perhaps the haulers will only have half their usual workload come December. Ogi frowned at the reference to the often gang-affiliated body disposal contractors, but nodded in agreement. I felt a bit bad at dumping proverbial cold water on his good mood, but it was important to keep the stakes in mind when evaluating progress. Shinjuku had taken a step in the correct direction, but that single step didn't make up for the long flight of stairs it had been shoved down. In all likelihood, the same old trucks would cruise the streets of the Ghetto with their grisly cargo as winter increased the caloric requirements for survival and weakened already damaged immune systems. The weak and frail, the very young and the very old, the unfortunate and the foolish, would all die. In a way, it was almost a fulfillment of the Britannian ideal. The strong would live and the unworthy would shiver their last hours away. Like all things Britannian, that ideal was hypocritical in application and fundamentally corrupt. Fortunately, I now had the basic tools to carry out some artificial selection of my own. I might not be able to prevent the usual winter death toll, but this year I'll damned well make sure the gangs don't profit from it. Backpack to boxcar. Report, over. I resumed walking as I released the transmit button. Ogi fell into step beside me, taking care to shorten his usual stride so he wouldn't leave me behind. A few seconds later, the radio crackled to life. Boxcar to backpack. We're through the gate. The pass and the envelope full of cash worked. ETA 5 to 8 minutes, over. Far more interference than out in the boonies, but still understandable. Good, I was worried about that. Backpack to boxcar. Keep up the good work. Remember to check the receiver, over. A moment later, a thought crossed my mind, and I turned and looked up at Ogi. Ino probably has the evening meal well underway by now, right? Unless things have changed. Ogi mulled the question over for a second before shrugging, probably so. Besides, I'm sure she'd be able to find something for Tsubuki and whoever's driving the truck, even if Den is not quite ready yet. Deliberately ignoring both the knowing smile on the man's face and the irritation heating my neck, when did he get so smug about predicting my motives? I thumbed the channel back on. Backpack to boxcar. Take your time and get a meal while you're there. A momentary pause, and I continued. And remember your table manners, you're still on the clock. Backpack out. I crammed the radio back into the Randoseru and strode forward, continuing the familiar trip to the apartment. Irritatingly, Ogi easily kept up with me. Damn him and his long legs. Somehow, he picked up on that thought and laughed at me. When I tried to pick up speed, I was, after all, eager to see Naoto again and to report in after months away. The bastard laughed even harder. I almost turned on my heel to lay into Ogi, to wipe that laughing smile away by threatening him with remedial courses back at the school, but then I remembered that he would be heading back soon enough regardless of my threat. Someone with rank needed to keep an eye on Anoda, after all, and Ogi was already familiar with the man and with the school. I guess I'll let him laugh a bit longer before I shut him up. I had told Naoto to expect us at 1600, and I felt very gratified as I knocked on the door to his apartment at 1600 on the dot. Sometimes, it's the small pleasures that make the day worthwhile. Almost immediately, the door swung open, revealing a barely recognizable, albeit beaming, Naoto. Despite his smile, his bloodshot eyes were momentarily wary, his free hand held behind his back, clearly gripping some kind of weapon. A second later, the wariness had vanished and Ogi was being pulled into the apartment, and into Naoto's embrace. Ogi, man, great to see you, Naoto laughed with undisguised glee, slapping his second on the back enthusiastically. You're looking tanned as hell, guess that mountain air did you good, huh? Ogi was more restrained in joy to be back in his shared apartment, but eagerly returned Naoto's embrace, minus the backslapping. Guess it did. I could have done with a bit less snow, though. I took the opportunity to follow the other two officers into the apartment, closing the door behind me as Naoto exclaimed, "Oh yeah, I bet it gets real deep up in the mountains," as he released Ogi and turned to me. "And Tanya. Whoa, when did you get so tall? I was about to make a joke about you getting buried in the snow, but I guess that's not an issue now." "I wouldn't go that far," I demurred, idly chatting as I looked around the studio apartment instead of focusing on Naoto. Idly, I noticed the pistol he'd been holding while answering the door wasn't the Britannian standard issue sidearm. Wonder where he got such a large caliber coil gun? And with a silencer, no less. I only gained a few centimeters, and Ogi was kind enough to act as my snowplow until the spring melt had begun. Remembering my manners, I held out my hand. "It's good to see you again, sir." Nato brushed my proffered hand aside and hugged me too. A moment later, I remembered to return the hug. It was difficult. While I had never been particularly physically expressive, this time I was more worried about somehow breaking Nato if I touched him. He already looked so fragile. When I had left Shinjuku behind, Nato had looked like a somewhat overworked and overstressed office worker in his mid to late 20s, ignoring his unprofessionally long red hair. Of course, despite the dark shadows under his eyes, he'd still been very energetic, throwing himself into whatever task was at hand with all his might and enthusiasm. Nato had aged a decade in the 4 months since I'd last seen him. His smile still had a shadow of the boyish energy I remembered from our first meeting, but his wide and glassy eyes, ringed with dark circles, goggled out from his sallow face. Deep lines of stress and fatigue were carved into his forehead, and his face was overrun with bristling stubble. Not to mention the stink. Over the last few months, I had forgotten how hard it was to stay clean in the ghetto. With only cold water available from the taps, and also either homemade or purchased at a premium from smugglers importing Britannian goods into Shinjuku, for years cleanliness had been out of the question for me. That had only turned around once I had met Ogi and Naoto, and once the rising sun had made it far easier to import necessities through the Britannian checkpoints. But Naoto had slipped, and slipped hard, on matters of hygiene. When I had met him, I had been somewhat astonished at how clean he had been, compared to the men I had labored beside on the work crews. Now, his shoulder-length red hair was matted and greasy, his fingers were yellow with cigarette residue and grime, and his breath reeked with halitosis. "I think," Naoto said, leaning back from the embrace and smiling down at me, "that you can call me by name now. In fact, I insist, don't call me Sir, Tanya." He smirked, and ruffled my hair. "After all, I've been following your plan while you've been away. Maybe I should start calling you Mom, eh?" I scowled up at Naoto, but I didn't have the heart to chide him for teasing me. Humor is, after all, a perfectly valid coping mechanism, and he'd clearly had a hard time lately. And if he wants things to be a bit more familiar when we're in private, I suppose that's fine too. No need for that, Naoto. I'm just following your orders. I paused for a moment, trying to remember how Naoto had put it when he'd redefined my duties months ago, before parroting his own words back. "Think about the big picture stuff and the logistics, and work out with Nagata so you get some muscle?" I arched an eyebrow as I lifted my arm up for inspection, pushing the t-shirt up out of the way and flexing my bicep. "I believe I've made a good start on both of those tasks, yes?" Naoto laughed at that, and jokingly squeezed my arm. "Looks like the country life was good for you, both of you." He turned back to Ogi, who had dropped his backpack off on his bed before rejoining us by the table. "You're looking pretty good too, Ogi. The training must have really been intense, huh? Is Tanya really that much of a taskmaster?" "Oh, you have no idea." Ogi circled the table and clapped his hands on my shoulders, before dropping down heavily onto one of the mismatched chairs, which creaked under his weight. "This one was only half the problem. I'm going to have to go back to the school the day after tomorrow to keep an eye on the other half." "Wait, the school? You're calling the training facility the school?" As we'd been talking, the flat look in Naoto's eyes had diminished as he grew more involved and interested in the conversation. Despite this, he still seemed to somehow be looking through Ogi and I, instead of looking at us. But as Ogi nodded in confirmation, the flat look disappeared entirely for the first time since he'd opened the apartment door. In its place, a look of flabbergasted wonder, mingled with amusement, spread across Naoto's face. He was still filthy, obviously stressed out, and deep into sleep debt, but in that moment, he no longer looked prematurely aged. "You can't call it the school." Naoto collapsed into another chair, and theatrically rubbed at his brow. "Which one of you geniuses came up with that? Do you want the trainees to come up with their own name for the place? Was it Ogi?" "I bet it was Ogi." I bristled slightly as Naoto sighed dramatically. Admittedly, I hadn't been able to come up with a clever name for the training facility, and it was true that I'd just started referring to the place as the school for lack of anything better, but marketing was not part of my core skill set, damn it. "There's something to be said for elegance and simplicity," I replied, perhaps a touch frostily, as I joined the other two at the table, "and I couldn't care less what the trainees call the place, as long as they learn enough to be worth my time." Naoto nodded agreeably. "Yeah, Wouldn't want to haul them all the way out to the boonies only for them to screw up and catch a bullet their first day out. Ogi winced, and reached across the table and patted one of my suddenly clenched fists. I closed my eyes, tuning out Naoto's mortified expression as I took a deep breath, held it, and released it. I need to remember to visit Sumare's family to convey the news. When I opened my eyes again, Naoto was staring off into the space beyond my shoulder, all trace of his earlier amusement gone. A moment later, he blinked and refocused on me. "I'm sorry, Tanya." His voice was gruff, and sounded somewhat choked. "That was a stupid thing to say." It's been a while since I could talk to anyone without being on my game." Naoto sighed, leaned forward, and cradled his forehead in his hands. "I've been so busy and so stressed. I can't even sleep a full night anymore." He sat back up, rubbing at his head. "But that's no excuse to be a jackass. I'm sorry. I've lost a few too. Mostly militia, but one of Chihiro's girls bought it a month back. It was damned bad luck too. We bandaged the cut, but it got infected, and..." He shrugged helplessly. "She's still kinda broken up about it." "Chihiro, I mean, she took it kinda badly." I nodded, trying to indicate that I accepted his apology. I wasn't quite sure how to respond to that piece of news. On one hand, it was, of course, unfortunate to lose comrades, but on the other, it didn't feel quite as raw personal as my own losses felt. I suppose I only knew Chihiro's team for a month, and then I left for the camp. That's probably it. Distance and time make separation easier. I would need to pay Chihiro a visit, sooner rather than later. I hadn't really gotten to know either Chihiro or Suichiro outside of a professional capacity, and I suspect that might have had an adverse impact on our relationships. While Chihiro had been at best cool towards me, perhaps now that we had a shared misfortune to bond over, I could mend some bridges. Plus, it'd also be a good idea to see if everyone else who stayed behind in Shinjuku looks as exhausted as Naoto. If they are, that's an issue, and if they aren't, that's also an issue. "That's truly unfortunate, Naoto," I began, trying to express my sincere feelings of regret over the loss of a comrade without sounding like I was faking a personal grief that I wasn't sure I truly felt. She was his comrade and subordinate too. If you can't truly feel sad about her death, try to feel sad for him and for his loss. Speaking from experience, I can say that it's hard to have people die under your command. It all sounded wooden and pro forma, even in my own ears. I began to feel that irritating heat of embarrassment and shame crawling up the back of my neck. How the hell did Ogi make talking about this look so easy? And how did he sound so honest? It was just another reminder, as if I needed one, of the importance of finding people who could support me and cover my weaknesses. In that case, best to delegate the task of sympathy to someone competent. "I'm sure Ogi can and will put this better, but I'm sorry for your loss. I will visit Chihiro later and console her as well." I forced my mouth closed, as the words began to tumble out, somehow emotional and stilted at the same time. The itchy heat crawled further up my spine, but I refused to submit to it, and plowed my way back to more familiar ground. "Back to business now. Before that, how about you give me a rundown of the last few months, here in Shinjuku? What's happened since Ogi and I left?" Kozuki Naoto smiled at the true leader of the Rising Sun Benevolent Association, and tried not to show how exhausted he truly felt behind his politician's mask. The not as tiny blonde really had grown significantly over her absence from Shinjuku, both physically and emotionally. Limbs that could once only be called scrawny were now toned. Already sun-gold hair had been bleached by the sun to a near white towards the tips, and Tanya gave the overall impression of constrained energy, only barely holding herself in place. The chronic fatigue from the first months she had slept in a nest of blankets on the floor of his apartment was, as far as Naoto could tell, completely gone. More importantly, Tanya clearly had opened up to Ogi, at the very least. Naoto's own skills of personal observation, initially cultivated by his father and developed by his time caring for his sister and mother, had been strengthened over the intervening months by his dealings with the public safety committees. Now, the girl's previously enigmatic body language spoke volumes. She was looser and less controlled in her gestures, yet also increasingly confident in expressing emotion both physically and aloud. And yet, at the core, Tanya was the same. The dark bags beneath her eyes were gone, but the fierce intelligence shining in those startlingly blue eyes was just as piercing as it had been when she'd made her recruitment pitch so long ago. She was seasoned by experience, and judging by how she'd accepted Ogi touching her hand, she no longer flinched away from human contact. She had clearly gone from strength to strength. I wish I could say the same thing about myself, Naoto thought, doing his best to package away the grief and lingering horror over Makoto's agonizing death, but even Ogi looked shocked when he saw me. Guess it's even worse than that time we went on a 5-day bender. At first, it was business as usual. Naoto kept his focus on Tanya as he began, but angled his head so he could face Ogi, including him in the conversation as well. I focused on keeping up the pressure on the gangs with Tamaki and Chihiro's crews. We spent a fair amount of time conducting reconnaissance to sniff out their hideouts and stash houses and hauling a few choice gang members into basements for friendly chats. Suichiro was instrumental when it came to interrogations. He still remembers plenty from when he was a policeman, so that's not too much of a surprise, I guess. Thanks to the intel we had gathered, we were able to keep up the pressure and hit various gang facilities, including armories and supply dumps. It was, Naoto thought, amazing how such a brief summary could reduce weeks of effort into a list of seemingly trivial affairs. Hours spent carefully shadowing gang members through the crowded streets of Shinjuku, long nights of staking out targeted apartments and safe houses, and moments of intense violence as he and his comrades burst into said safe houses in the early morning and hauled their targets away to basements and subway tunnels across Shinjuku, all reduced to a handful of sentences. We managed to spread out pretty far, and ended up claiming a lot of territory around the Rising Sun's meeting house. Turns out, establishing firm control over the area solved a few of Ino's headaches, since the gangs weren't around anymore, and since we had control over all the territory between the meeting house and the Mejiro Avenue checkpoint by mid-February, we were able to import a ton of food into Shinjuku, as well as make significant progress on fixing up some of the infrastructure. Clearing drains, fixing roads, that kinda stuff. It had been amazing, watching Shinjuku come back to life as the food and construction supplies had poured in. For the first time since Naoto had left his family to come live with Ogi in Shinjuku, the seemingly inexorable decay had been reversed. Potholes had been filled in and shattered asphalt had been melted down and rolled back into freshly repaved roads. Rebuilding the drains had been a momentous task, and Naoto wasn't fully confident in their amateurish work, but hopefully the pipes and streets full of standing water wouldn't make a reappearance come the monsoon season. Money had been difficult, of course. The money gained from the raid on the subway station was long gone, and without reselling drugs seized in subsequent raids within the ghetto, the cash taken in those same raids could only go so far. Expanding the Rising Sun's operations was an expensive undertaking, and the costs had quickly mounted up. From the bribes paid to the checkpoint guards, to the cost of construction materials, food shipments, work permits, tools, and the rental fees for the trucks, the costs were never-ending. To say nothing of the costs of Mr. Asahara's specialist devices. Even with his discount for virtuous works and repeat customers, his work demanded a premium. But in the end, they had managed to make ends meet, somehow. Kalen had managed to net some donations from the more paternalistic invaders in the Tokyo settlement by publishing several articles that spoke eloquently about the plight of the honorary Britannians and how much the Rising Sun had done to alleviate their suffering, while dancing around the reasons why the honorary Britannians were in such dire straits in the first place. Then, with the seed money provided by those donations, Ino have come up with a scheme to buy work passes into the settlement, where 11s could find day labor or other low-paying work. She distributed the passes to Shinjuku denizens who didn't have the means to pay the necessary processing fees, on the understanding that a significant portion of their wages would be handed over to the Rising Sun Benevolent Association in the name of purchasing more such passes. Between the paternal Britannian donations, the trickle of money seized from gangsters, and the income from their workforce, Rising Sun had just barely kept their heads above water. So, yeah, things were going very smoothly for the first 3 weeks or so. We didn't tag all the places we hit, so some of the gangs thought they were under attack from the others. Honestly, I think lots of them were just surprised to be attacked at all. Guess they got arrogant, or maybe they actually believed that the purists attacked Shinjuku Kyoime, who knows. Anyway, it took them a while to get a clue and stop messing around. Naoto felt his smiling mask slip slightly as he remembered the end of the good times. Over the course of a week in mid-February, Things had spiraled from bad to worse. They started getting smarter, posting more guards, setting up actual checkpoints near their bases, their officers starting to enforce some kind of discipline, and the really smart ones started buying better weapons. Most of the low-ranking guys had been using knives and blunt weapons and only the higher-ups had pistols, but now lots of the lower-ranking gangsters were carrying guns and the elites, the ones who liked to dress up as Britannians, started getting military gear. It was pretty jarring to suddenly have something like parity, you know? No clue who was flooding the market with Britannian army weapons that must have fallen off a truck somewhere, but suddenly every gang officer had an SMG to call their own. Thank the gods they never bothered to learn how to aim, much less actually maintain their new toys. Anyway, we were still able to pick off strays, but taking the war to the gangs got far too risky by the first week of March or so. Naoto, Ino, and Suichiro had spent a considerable amount of time trying to figure out where the gangs were getting their new equipment without success. It was possible that the gangs were buying their weapons from corrupt Britannians with access to military supplies in the settlement, but that didn't answer the question of how the guns were being trafficked into Shinjuku. A possibility was that the larger and more powerful gangs, the ones who directly catered to the Britannians, had decided for some reason to flood Shinjuku with military-grade weaponry, perhaps at the behest of the Britannians or some third party. That didn't make sense though, since the big gangs didn't profit from it in any way that Naoto could discern. For his part, Naoto suspected that the street gangs that he had fought over the last 3 months were probably getting their weapons from the same source that the now-defunct Kokorokai had gotten the nightmare Tanya had blown up in Shinjuku Gyoime Station months ago from. He had no hard evidence, but that nightmare had been remarkably out of place in that weapons market back then, almost as out of place as the sudden flood of military-grade weapons was now. The real problem was the numbers. Chihiro's group, Tamaki's group, Suichiro, and me, that's 10, weren't really able to both attack the newly equipped gangsters and protect the rising sun at the same time. So, we switched to the defensive. Mr. Asahara knew a guy who knew a guy, and we bought some scoped rifles from him. Is there any chance? Tanya abruptly interrupted, leaning forward slightly with an air that reminded Naoto of a falcon zeroing in on a suddenly exposed target, that the gangs were perhaps buying their weapons from Mr. Asahara's acquaintance as well? Naoto blinked, feeling momentarily befuddled as he ran the idea through his mind. To his sudden and growing irritation, he realized that he had never considered the possibility, and that he really should have. Guess I still have a lot to learn, he thought. Thank the gods Tanya's on my side. Aloud, he admitted, it's a possibility, but not one I'd considered. Ogi nodded. It's definitely worth a follow-up, at the very least. Arms dealers aren't known for their scruples, after all. Naoto nodded, and then continued his report. Chihiro and her team set up some apartments overlooking the major streets in and around Rising Sun territory as snipers' nests and started picking off anybody wearing gang scarves that they could see. While they weeded out the brave and the foolish, Tamaki's crew and I took shifts watching over the construction crews and the meeting house in case any got through. Split up into pairs, with the pacifist Kasumi acting as a spotter for Chihiro, Chihiro's team had shifted from sniper's nest to sniper's nest several times each day, with at least one pair active at all times. The gunfire from the rooftops had proven amazingly effective at disrupting the various gangs' amateurish incursion attempts. The scarf-clad thugs had no idea what to do in the face of the high-powered rifles. The heavy bullet effortlessly pierced the crude homemade body armor the gangs tried to put together, and the abundant practice on live targets meant Chihiro's girls were remarkably accurate with their weapons. A single-pair team could effectively lock down entire roads, shredding attempted invasions with ease. As always, the only problem had been that Chihiro and her girls could only cover a small slice of the urban jungle at any given time. Still, we were getting pressed pretty hard. Lots of our workers had gotten beaten up, and some were severely injured. We were pushing ourselves harder and harder to be everywhere, but all that did was tire everybody out even faster. It was only a matter of time until we were forced back. Thankfully, I remembered how you'd reached out to the locals and their committees. I told them that we were having trouble keeping the gangsters out and the food coming in, and that they needed to help us out if they wanted to keep eating. Problem was, they weren't organized, every block and street and tenement doing its own thing, you know? So, that was the first step, getting them all on the same page. And boy, was that a gigantic first step, Naoto wryly reflected. It was astonishing how people, even with so little to lose and everything to gain, could have so many grudges. And those grudges were incredibly petty in scope. This block asserted that that block had been dumping their waste onto this block's street, so that they'd have to pay the hauler crews to deal with it. That tenement committee asserted that the tenement next door was using too much water, reducing the already low water pressure in the barely functional plumbing system and depriving the upper floors of their tenement of water altogether. Trying to get everyone to cooperate had been an endless headache, but thankfully Naoto had leverage over virtually everybody in the Rising Sun zone. After all, nobody wanted to go back to eating watery soup once a day. Fortunately, they all needed the supplies we were bringing in, plus we'd built up some good credit by dealing with the gangsters for the last few months. So, they all agreed that the Rising Sun should be in charge, but dealing with their grievances with each other took some work. After I helped arbitrate a few of their disputes, we got representatives from the 10 or so biggest groups in the Rising Sun territory to agree to work together, and to join a central committee that I'd be chairing. Truth be told, Naoto had desperately tried to find someone, anyone, who could handle the committee nonsense in his place. Unfortunately, the only other viable leader would be Ino, who had flatly refused. "You're the charismatic one," she said when he had asked her directly, not to mention the noble's son, and the one who they've all been talking to. "You handle the politics, and I'll make sure you've got all the carrots you need to get them to cooperate." And so, Naoto had found himself once again thrust into a leadership role he felt unqualified for, but this time, he felt like he'd actually managed to do a good job. I told the committee that we were having trouble, and needed help. We could give them weapons, but we needed bodies to use them. Some of the recruits who'd signed up after Christmas stepped up, which was a good start, but the leaders didn't want to just hand over their people to us. We managed to work out a compromise, where I'd consult the committee before making any big moves, but I'd be allowed to manage their day-to-day as I saw fit. It had been a difficult task to get the committee to concede even that much. While few of the local leaders considered the Rising Sun Association a threat to their personal authority, thanks to Tanya's early policy of treating said leaders as stakeholders and partners instead of potential rivals, none were eager to concede even a fragment of their personal power bases. Naoto had been forced to lean on his role as the conduit of food, ammunition, and weapons into the territory to assert his ultimate authority over the newly formed Sun Guards militia. So, we got a militia set up. I armed them with gear we'd liberated from gang armories the month before and put them in charge of patrolling and guarding the territory. Their job was to hold things together until I could send Tamaki or Chihiro as reinforcements to deal with any troublemakers. It had been far from an ideal solution. For one, the Sun Guards stuck out in the open as highly visible targets ran the risk of being overrun before reinforcements could arrive. Fortunately, most of the gangsters who swaggered into Rising Sun territory were there to try and gain respect from their crew and loot, not to die for a few meters of pavement. Once the nearby Sun Guards units started rallying to the pinned unit, or once Chihiro's snipers or Tamaki's now veteran street fighters appeared, most gangs broke and ran rather than stay and fight. Of course, that was only if the rank-and-file gangsters weren't accompanied by any of the competent gang officers. The presence of leaders or veteran fighters willing and able to hold their own increased the danger presented by the gang incursions significantly. Unsupervised, the rank-and-file members were content to fire a few bad shots and hang back, but under the eyes of their bosses, they were far more willing to close with the enemy, more afraid of their leaders than they were of Naoto and his comrades. The gangs didn't like this very much, and made several attempts to take back control over their lost territory. They tried to mimic our hit-and-run attacks, but that mostly amounted to them just charging in and breaking everything they could, or ambushing an isolated militia patrol. They tried a few big attacks. Once, a few local gangs rallied and showed up with a few hundred men. That was a bit of a dangerous moment. The fools didn't realize we'd known they were coming. Wouldn't you know it, hungry gangsters can be bribed with food too. Naoto mimed an expression of theatrical shock. Tanya's cool gaze and lone-arched eyebrow said that she wasn't impressed with his attempt to inject a moment of humor, but Naoto was rewarded by a slight upward twitch of her lips. He smirked for a moment, before exhaling, the humor slipping away as he returned to his report. That's not really a surprise, not like gangs are very good at building loyalty, or information security. Since we knew when they were coming and where they'd show up, we had time to buy some of Mr. Asahara's best and set up a nice little ambush. Tanya's lips twitched upwards again, and Naoto saw a quick flash of teeth before she seemed to remember that she was on duty and suppressed her visible amusement. She always loves her little ambushes, Naoto thought fondly. Those early memories of Tanya, fresh from her truck hijacking and dripping with gore, were old enough to almost be nostalgic. It had been, in Naoto's opinion, a plan worthy of Tanya, simple in execution, yet highly effective. A handful of nail bombs concealed by random garbage strewn around the planned line of advance and activated via tripwire had scythed at knee-height through the approaching mob of gangsters. Immediately, the smart ones and those lucky enough to avoid debilitating injury turned and fled, abandoning their injured and crippled comrades to the rising sun's tender mercies. Naoto had seen little reason to offer any of the gangsters any hint of mercy, and instead stood back and let the militia have their fun. The gangsters had chosen their side, they could reap the whirlwind. Years of fear of the swaggering bullies had boiled forth in an orgy of freely expressed rage, and justice had been meted out with bricks, bats, and knives. The mess had been awful, as had the noise, but Naoto hadn't been able to find it in himself to care. Plus, he'd had no shortage of volunteers eager to clean up the mess in the aftermath. In the end, the inhabitants of the Rising Sun slice of Shinjuku hadn't even needed to deal with the sanitation hazard of 30-odd corpses smeared across the pavement, much less a return to gang subjugation. Eventually, we managed to kill enough of the bastards to get them to back off, once and for all. They've still been poking around the edges, hassling construction crews and trying to hijack trucks bringing supplies in, but we've been able to handle that. Turns out, having the dismembered bodies of your thugs dropped off in your territory sends a message. After things cooled down, I managed to get most of the militia guys back to working on fixing up the territory, since we didn't need as many guards. One of those attempted hijackings had actually been how poor Makoto had ended up with a knife in her bicep. A gangster had jumped up on the running board of the truck she had been driving as she slowed around a corner and put the knife to her throat through the open window. She'd managed to shove his arm back and away, ultimately pushing him off the running board, but in the process had taken a nasty gash across the bicep. Despite attempts at disinfecting the wound with moonshine, it had turned septic, and a week later Makoto had died as the fever ravaged her body. It had been a painful and ultimately avoidable death, but Naoto was quietly thankful that Makoto had been the only one of his people who had died during the 3 months of near-constant violence. Several of the Sun Guard militia had died, and he felt badly about them and had taken the time to visit widows and families, but they weren't his people the way Chihiro and Tamaki's teams were. Chihiro had been utterly inconsolable, and Naoto had ended up giving her a week off to spend with her sister. He still needed to find someone else, preferably female, to slot into the vacancy in her squad. Eventually, we managed to get enough hands available and enough resources built up that we could start some of those other projects you'd floated a while back, Tanya. Trying to improve the ghetto's resource base, and maybe get a little self-sufficiency, in case the Brits decide to squeeze us again. Plus, it gave everybody more work to do instead of just standing around or working on the drains, which is always a good thing. Tamaki, surprisingly, had been the one to point out what a bad idea it was to leave armed and angry young people, mostly men, without anything to do. I know I'd probably do something stupid, he'd admitted to Naoto after one of their team meetings in the old basement headquarters, but if you keep 'em busy, they'll be too tired to do much damage. Thankfully, improving Shinjuku was a functionally endless task, and Naoto wasn't running out of projects in need of strong hands. Anyway, we started building planters for rooftop vegetable gardens, rain funnels into cisterns, and stuff like that. One of the militia guys actually had a good idea about how to purify water on the cheap using the sun's heat and a glass pane, in case the water mains get damaged or the Britannians decide to turn the water off. Getting the window glass for it into the ghetto and up to the roofs intact was difficult, but we managed. Of course, we had to build the distillers to a somewhat smaller scale than we wanted, since typhoon season's going to be starting in a few weeks and we'd need to haul them inside when the winds turn. We even managed to give Suikiro's poultry coop's idea a stab. The test coop is actually up on the roof of this building, in a shack we rigged up. The first batch of chicks is still growing, so we haven't had any eggs yet, much less meat, but Suikiro's pretty happy about it so far. Naoto subsided back into his chair, and took a sip from the glass of water Ogi had slid across the table to him as he talked. He'd been speaking for the last 10 minutes, and he felt like he could easily speak for hours more, if Tanya really wanted a blow-by-blow, or wanted the details of how he, Chihiro, and Suichiro had really acquired that intelligence from abducted gangsters. It had been a turbulent few months, and Naoto couldn't say that he was proud of everything he had been party to, everything that he had ordered, over that time. On the other hand, despite Tanya's absence, things hadn't fallen apart. He had held the line, and indeed moved it forward, advancing the Rising Sun's control over Shinjuku while improving the quality of life for those under his control. While Tanya, inexplicable genius that she was, could probably have accomplished just as much as he had, Naoto doubted she could have done much more. Feeling somewhat lighter, now that he'd had a chance to express the events of the last 3 months to someone who understood the pressure of leadership, he gestured at Tanya, encouraging her to speak. "So, it's been a pretty busy 3 months. How about you?" "A busy 3 months," he says. Honestly, Naoto was badly underselling himself and his achievements by concluding his report on such a blasé note. When I had left Shinjuku in January, I had expected them to hold the line, and to continue the Rising Sun's humanitarian efforts. I had expected the sudden loss of trained personnel and stockpiled resources and, if I was being honest, my direct oversight, to have arrested the growth of the Kozuki organization's control over Shinjuku. How could I have been so arrogant? In believing that only I could make a difference, I had fallen for my own hype. A handful of minor successes, and I'm already turning into a megalomaniac? Unacceptable. Contrary to my expectations, Naoto and Ino had taken my half-baked plan for potential future improvements to Shinjuku and run with it, in the process achieving an almost unimaginable degree of success. Wait, maybe he wasn't teasing me by saying he was following my plan? But true, I had sketched out the plan, which was a generous term for the collection of speculations and dreams that it truly was, shortly after Naoto had given me permission to start the Rising Sun Benevolent Association. I had expanded on it after Ogi had told me about the 6 houses of Kyoto, while trying to assemble a pitch for these potential investors, only to more or less drop the project as the man from Kyoto dashed my hopes of significant support. But I couldn't really call it my plan, especially not after Naoto had put so much hard work into expanding and realizing it. It was humbling. In 3 months, I had built 2 platoons of effective and highly mobile fighters, training and equipping them for the long fight to come, and had led them to a pair of minor victories. In that same time, Naoto had significantly improved the infrastructure of our zone of control, enforced that zone of control against all comers despite being greatly outnumbered, constructed a far larger army than I had, and had formed a government in embryo. I found myself looking at my profoundly tired leader with fresh eyes. Is this how the 203rd had looked at me? When I had first met him, I had seen a charismatic warlord on the rise, a young man determined to set fire to the world that had left him a disinherited bastard in his own land. Later, I had seen him as a well-intentioned if somewhat naive and decidedly inexperienced leader, a green officer who, while promising, needed to be carefully instructed and handled. Now though, after I had taken a step back, after I had ceased to hover over his shoulder. Familiarity may not always breed contempt, but it does make it easy to take people for granted, and in hindsight, I had taken Naoto and his dependency on my tactical acumen for granted. I had never stopped recognizing his institutional authority over me, and I had never doubted that his charisma gave him a great deal of sway over the members of the Kozuki organization, but somewhere along the way I had stopped looking to him for orders. I had simply concocted plans, and expected him to follow them. I had initially followed Kozuki Naoto out of fear, and out of a need for support. Once the fear had lapsed, I had followed him because he had the respect of those around him, and because he had respected me. But now, I felt like I could follow him out of legitimate respect. I would, of course, still create plans, determine objectives, set goals. That was what he had appointed me to do, after all, but I would be sure to get his input when I did so. When I had left Shinjuku, he had risen to the occasion, and truly proved himself worthy of my loyalty. Naoto, I began, trying to figure out how to put that sentiment into words without admitting my earlier potentially disloyal thoughts. The man himself paused mid-sip, and put his glass of water back on the table, focusing his attention back on me. His blue eyes had seemingly darkened with fatigue, and it seemed like he was staring straight through me, glaring at a point just behind my head. You have made a commendable effort. Ogi and I were both deeply impressed by the cleanliness and order we saw on our way here. The place hasn't looked this good in the last 6 years. Ogi interjected, backing me up. I nodded in acknowledgement to him, before turning back to Naoto. I still need to catch up on the details. 3 months worth of broad strokes crammed into a 10-minute summary was a good starting point, but I would need more information before I could begin planning prospective next moves. And it sounds like I will need to visit Ino as soon as possible, so she can get me up to speed with the Rising Sun's current operations. I saw Ogi open his mouth, and I hurried to preempt him. After I visited Chihiro and offered my condolences, of course. Ogi closed his mouth, but he was still frowning at me. There's just no pleasing some people. Hey, don't leave yet. Naoto made a staying gesture, hand trembling slightly as he beckoned me to stay seated. I still want to hear what you've been up to over the last few months. Plus, his thin lips twitched into a slight smirk. Someone's coming to see you. I told her you'd be arriving back in Shinjuku today, and she's very eager to see you again. I blinked, momentarily confused by Naoto's ambiguous phrasing, before abruptly realizing who he hadn't mentioned yet. Ah yes, how rude of me. How is the family, Naoto? I hope your mother and sister are well? And on that topic, have you heard from your father lately, Naoto? What's he planning, across the Pacific in the homeland? Naoto chuckled. Last I heard, Mom's doing fine. I haven't gone to see her in months. To be honest, I've been busy, and the last thing I need is a scolding to take care of myself. He looked like he was about to say something else, looked at me, and visibly reconsidered. A second later he shook his head, and smiled. I'll let Kalen speak for herself, she should be here in an hour or so. He leaned back slightly in his chair, and folded his hands behind his head, pulling his jacket up and revealing the empty shoulder holster concealed below. Just long enough for you to tell me about your spring vacation to Gunma. I nodded, acknowledging the implicit order. Well then. I closed my eyes, and took a minute to quickly get my thoughts in order. A moment later, I was ready. While still a work in progress, I am generally satisfied with the quality of the initial test cohort of trainees. They were no 203rd, but I had neither asked nor expected them to be. For a group of new recruits, many of them suffering from chronic malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies, the double-sized first cohort had done an admirable job in their training. I have brought 28 of the first cohort back to Shinjuku with me, leaving the other platoon in place to act as training cadre, as well as to deal with the logistics of keeping the school functional. The school curriculum, at present, provides general military training, supplemented with specific scouting and ambush training. I continued, moving on to discussing what the returning recruits could be expected to know and what tasks they could be expected to perform. They are physically fit, capable of both distance marches at speed and sprinting while carrying up to 35 kilograms. They are all able to drive manual transmission vehicles, and can conduct basic vehicular maintenance, as well as sabotage. They are all confident marksmen, and are qualified with standard-issue Britannian sidearms and assault rifles, as well as shoulder-fired missile launchers. They are all trained in the correct and safe usage of radios and other communications devices, and have also been trained to install basic wiretaps and other surveillance and signal interception devices. All have been given a thorough education in basic strategy, ambush tactics, basic logistics, and the political and ideological basis of both the Britannian occupation and our own continued struggle. I paused, realizing that I had dropped into a monotone as I listed point after point from the basic training package. This is a summary report, fool. Stop reciting the syllabus. Of course, that's a good start, but I hope to expand the school towards more specialized programs over time, including a greater focus on human intelligence operations, demolitions and explosive device assembly, and, provided we can find training pods, nightmare piloting and maintenance. Naoto nodded in approval. Having skilled bomb makers in our organization would make us less dependent on Mr. Asahara, which seems like a really good idea if he really is somehow involved in arming our enemies here in Shinjuku. I hummed my agreement. It hadn't escaped me that Mr. Asahara was remarkably connected. When we had first sought out the 6 houses, he had put us into contact with Kyoto, and now, he had put Naoto in contact with whatever arms dealer had sold him those sniper rifles and ammunition. Not to mention how unconcerned he was when I threatened to shoot off his other leg back when we first met. The elderly engineer was an unknown, and I was increasingly certain that the less we depended on him, the better. Just like Anoda. Which, I said aloud, in a roundabout way brings me to the reason Ogi needs to return to the school as quickly as possible. You recall that the JLF was providing a liaison officer? Naoto nodded slowly, with an air of slight confusion. I suspect that he will attempt to suborn our trainees, left unattended. Wait, what? The slight confusion had progressed into angry bewilderment. He's trying to steal our recruits or take over your training school? Well, I don't have any hard evidence that he's planning anything of the sort, I admitted, but considering the man's personality, I'd almost be more surprised if he isn't trying something along those lines. He, Major Anoda Hero, is an intelligent man and a skilled soldier. He's also assisting his superior's bid to seize control over the JLF and has been remarkably open about his thoughts about my leadership, and for similar reasons may be suspect of yours as well. Tanya's very much underselling how unpleasant this guy is, Ogi interrupted, leaning into the conversation with a frown. When we arrived in Nakanojo for our first meeting with Anoda, he actually refused to speak to Tanya, much less acknowledge her leadership. He would only respond to what she said if I repeated it, and then he'd only speak to me, even though we were all in the same room. As Ogi spoke, gradually accelerating into an angry rant, he began drumming his fingers on the table's scarred surface, giving some outlet to his seething energy. Naoto seemed equally annoyed, although likely for more personal reasons, considering the mixed heritage we shared and the reactions some Japanese as well as most Britannians had to it. He has, in that respect, gotten better, I put in, although I frankly think that his early unwillingness to acknowledge me is the least of my concerns about him. Naoto turned to me, eyes full of clear disbelief, and I nodded in confirmation. I am more worried about his reckless disregard for the lives of civilians, both Japanese and honorary Britannian, and his eagerness to deliberately provoke tit-for-tat violence as a tool of boosting recruitment. He and his superior are also currently involved in an attempt to undermine the current leaders of the JLF, presumably to seize power for themselves. Naoto's eyes continued to widen as I went into greater detail, describing my conversations with Major Anoda, including the points when he had practically outlined his faction's ongoing Gekkoku campaign. By the time I finished describing Anoda's unconcealed joy at the round-the-clock activity of Niigata Prefecture's crematories, which considering that Britannians tended to be buried instead of burned spoke volumes, Naoto's expression had gone hard and flat. So, he's an asshole and clearly doesn't care about civilian casualties, Naoto summed up after I finished speaking. Why are we working with this man? Well, besides the fact that Kyoto House probably pushed the JLF to assign him to our facility deliberately, I began, he's a very skilled soldier, scout, and infiltrator, and has done a satisfactory job conveying those skills to our trainees. More to the point, the faction that he represents is the only part of the JLF that is actively interested in taking the fight to the Britannians, instead of remaining in their bunkers. They're also the only faction in the JLF currently willing to arm and supply us. I went over the first and second deals I had negotiated with Anoda, taking care to emphasize how much of a poisoned chalice the six houses had served us by pointedly not extending logistical support and by probably making sure Anoda, a known racist and bigot, was assigned to Laos with a detachment headed by a female Hafu. So, it was a case of making the best of a bad situation, I summed up, trying not to second-guess my decision-making process in the face of Naoto's obvious disgruntlement. Short of pulling back to Shinjuku and abandoning both the training camp idea and our credit with the six houses, I didn't see any other viable option. Naoto grunted an acknowledgement, before shaking his head, and smiling reassuringly at me. I'm not questioning your decisions, Tanya. It sounds like you did a good job in a bad situation. He started to frown again. I'm just questioning whether or not seeking help from the six houses was a good idea in retrospect. He leaned back in his chair, and massaged his forehead. I guess it doesn't matter, the deal's already been made. Did you say something about missions? Recognizing my cue, I briefly ran through the missions in Niigata and Nagano prefectures, going over the objectives of each mission, the plans, the executions, and the outcomes. Ogi jumped in periodically to add details that I had missed or neglected to include, but he was generally content to let me explain as the officer in the field what had happened on each mission. Naoto generally nodded along to each beat of my report, reserving his questions until I had finished running through each mission. The only time Naoto reacted differently was when I mentioned Squad 1's losses during the Niigata mission. I had mentioned that detail only because it was an important lessons learned point for the mission, and had thus only discussed that small tragedy in a professional manner. Despite my attempt to stay impersonal, my treacherous voice had warbled annoyingly, and I'd had to clear my throat. I saw Naoto and Ogi exchange a look, but I didn't know what it implied, nor did they explain. At the very least, Naoto did me the courtesy of not bringing up the minor but embarrassing burr in my presentation when he started to ask his questions. Unsurprisingly, Naoto was far more interested in the ambush of the Nightmare Convoy in Nagano than the radio station raid in Niigata. While he was attentive and interested in the details of the first mission I had conducted on Anoda's behalf, he was very clearly focused on the anti-nightmare measures I'd used in the second mission. I couldn't blame him. Not only was it a confrontation with a unit from the occupation army itself, if and when the vice-regal governor ever attacked Shinjuku, his vanguard would likely be composed mostly of nightmares. Knowing that they can be beaten by a non-peer force is a weapon in and of itself, I think. Eventually, Naoto's seemingly inexhaustible supply of questions finally tapered off, to my faint relief. It was gratifying to have an interested and engaged boss, not to mention one who clearly had trust in my decision-making process. Despite Naoto's past displays of trust in my judgment, I still occasionally found myself wondering when he would interrupt and chide me for overstepping my authority. That moment never came. Naoto only asked for further details or clarifications about our operations over the last 3 months. After dealing with Anoda's frequent slips back into semi-open contempt of my heritage or gender, simply relaxing around my fellow leaders was a surprisingly relaxing experience. "Well, it sounds like you guys have been pretty busy yourselves," Naoto commented, leaning back onto his chair's hind legs as I answered the last of his questions. "While I can't say I'm happy that we're more or less locked into dealing with this, Major Anoda," Naoto's mouth twisted, as if he bit into something rancid, "it seems like the deal's already paying off. So, we might as well make the most of it." I nodded. My thoughts exactly. I hadn't really expected Naoto to disagree with my decisions, but I was also happy that he seemed to understand why I had made those decisions and agreed with my reasoning. The similarities between my independent negotiations with Anoda's faction of the JLF and Kusakabe's efforts to undermine General Kotase through unsanctioned missions were not lost on me. Unlike Anoda and Kusakabe, I had no interest in undermining or overthrowing my leader. He knows that, doesn't he? Of course he does. I frowned, slightly uncomfortable with that line of thought, and wished that I had a cup of coffee at hand. It had been a long meeting, full of substantial dialogue and the exchange of important information, but no meeting really felt quite right without coffee. Besides, I've had to ration myself for months now. It's not fair. With a sigh, I pulled my mind back on track and I turned to Oki. "I think we've covered all the important developments, yes?" I was fairly certain everything worthy of discussion had already been handled, but I might have forgotten something. "Well, no. I quickly racked my brain, going over the turning points and major decisions of the recent months, but I couldn't think of anything I'd missed. And why is he looking at me so expectantly? "Tanya, isn't there something you're forgetting about? Something important?" Oki was neither glowering nor glaring at me, but there was something in the single raised eyebrow and the kindly, yet firm, set of his face that told me that, whether or not I felt this mystery topic was important, he surely did. What am I forgetting? What important thing does Naoto not know about that is important? Oh. I had never really decided to share knowledge of my magic with anybody else, including Ogi. That choice had been made for me, when Ogi had followed me to that cobble-strewn riverbank and seen something inexplicable. At that point, the decision had been taken from my hands. Lying to Ogi almost certainly would have backfired, and simply refusing to answer hadn't really been a viable option. Necessity had forced my hand, and for the first time since I had begun my third life, I had told somebody about one of my 2 most closely kept secrets. Unsurprisingly, I found myself resenting Ogi for forcing the issue here and now. Magic was my one inheritance from my second life, not to mention the secret to my survival in this wretched third life in Area 11. I had only lived this long because the people around me saw only a malnourished and weak girl, one incapable of defending herself or surviving on her own. This perception had allowed me to get the drop on the unwary, most notably when I had taken advantage of my malnourished frame to fold myself up behind a truck chair, only to use my magically enhanced strength to stab 2 gang members to death. On the other hand, I understood where Ogi was coming from. My magic was a factor that our leader needed to know about, so he could best quantify my abilities and assign me a workload commensurate with those abilities. And, going beyond the sort of cold logic that came so easily to me, I trusted Naoto, and he trusted me. He and Ogi had taken me in when they had very little, and I had nothing to contribute at all. He had seen my worth, and had promoted me in his organization, giving me both the authority and freedom to choose my own tasks and assignments. He had trusted me to keep Kalen safe during the subway raid, and had trusted me to handle negotiations with the 6 houses. He had trusted me. And, something that always left me feeling vaguely surprised when I consciously considered it, I trusted him as well, him and Ogi and the other 4 core members of the cell. I had trusted Naoto this far, I would trust him again. That's all well and good, but how do I introduce magic to him without sounding crazy? The same way I introduced it to Ogi, a demonstration, clearly. This time, an intentional demonstration. Naoto. I turned back towards the Kozuki organization's leader, which meant so much more now than it had a mere 6 months ago. His chair's front legs thudded into the worn linoleum as he shifted forward, exhaustion once again pushed back behind a businesslike mask of an expression, eyes following me attentively as I returned to the table. There is something else I need to discuss with you, something that I've been keeping to myself for quite some time. I tried not to wince at my own awkwardness, and forced myself to continue speaking, fighting down my rising anxiety as I stretched out my arms, palms up over the table. I honestly should have probably disclosed this information earlier, but I found the idea uncomfortable. Ogi smiled encouragingly at me, but Naoto just looked quizzically at me. He looked like he was about to say something, but looked over at Ogi and clearly reconsidered, gesturing for me to continue. Over the last 2.5 months, since Ogi had discovered me in the middle of practice, I had continued to experiment with the formulas from my past life. The original spells I learned in the Empire have been optimized for use with computation orbs, complicated carefully engineered bundles of smaller subsidiary spells. I had to work hard to tease out their individual components, such as the strength enhancement or the acceleration formula. Those small formulas had been low-hanging fruit, as both were integral to the flight spell package, the bread and butter working of every aerial mage in Imperial service. Without the strength enhancement, a human flying at hundreds of kilometers an hour would be shredded. Without enhanced reflexes, navigating around barriers was nigh impossible at high speeds. I had been intimately familiar with both in my previous life, and simplifying them down to an orbless level had been comparatively simple. But the flight package hadn't been the only spell I had memorized. As an aerial mage and a training officer, I had committed as many spells as I could manage to memory. Among others, I had memorized the round enchantment formula, the passive shell and active barrier formulas, the guidance formula that also served as a primitive means of radio wave interference, and of course the ever-handy mage blade formula. One of my least used spells had been the napalm-type formula, an explosion spell that was frankly inferior to the far more versatile artillery enchantment formula. However, inefficiencies aside, the napalm spell didn't require any container for the power, like the artillery enchantment did, and included a component to generate the pilot flame from pure magical energy. After much time and effort, I had managed to isolate the ignition component and found a way to cast it without the aid of a computational gem. Frankly, it was an unimpressive spell, more of a party trick than a tactical enhancement. It was an energy-intensive working, and actually projecting the flame or spreading it required an even larger investment of mental effort and energy. A lighter did everything my spell could at a far lower cost. But I could make a tongue of flame dance on the palm of my hand on command, and even a party trick could be useful in a demonstrative capacity. Yellow and orange tongues of flame sprang into being in each of my hands, stretched halfway across the table towards Naoto. While only 10 centimeters or so high, the flames were already greedily devouring my energy reserves. So inefficient. For a moment, I found myself feeling nostalgic for the Empire and its computational gems. I almost miss Shugal. Almost. The flames reflected in Naoto's goggling eyes, wide with a blend of what looked like shock, delight, and an unsettling degree of awe. His mouth hung slack, and his frown had disappeared, expression wide open and completely unguarded. It seemed like the demonstration had its intended effect. Mysterious flames are probably equally dramatic as a magically controlled fall. I'll have to remember that, for the unlikely event of any future demonstrations. Satisfied, I snuffed out the fire dancing on my left hand first, and then raised my right hand, palm aflame, to eye height before slowly reducing the flow of energy down to nothing, the flame dwindling as the supply tapered off. Let nobody say I lack presentation skills, and every good presentation needs a touch of the theatrical to hook the audience's emotions. I met Naoto's eyes across the table. You can call it magic, it's as good of a descriptor as anything, and the term that I use. Almost before I finished the sentence, I knew more of an explanation would be necessary. Naoto was far from a fool, and I had no doubt that he'd believe his own eyes, but Naoto was also a tired man, one who had spent the last several months looking for any edge he could use against our enemies. He's a politician too now. He has constituents. I need to make sure he knows what I can do, and more importantly what I can't do, before he starts getting ideas. I've had this power all my life, as far as I can tell. I maintained eye contact as I spoke, half expecting an angry outburst or a disbelieving laugh at any moment. The latter because my previously malnourished state made little sense for someone with such a power, the former because I had withheld knowledge about said power for the last year. I was able to muster extra energy, back when I was working to feed myself, energy that let me work the same hours and carry the same loads as some adults. Energy, strength, enhanced balance. But it wasn't a significant boost. I'm sure my old supervisors simply chalked it up to willpower, or perhaps desperation. Perhaps they simply didn't notice, or didn't care at all. Caring takes effort and energy, after all, and both of those were in short supply after the conquest. Either way, before I met you and Ogi, my magic was decidedly limited, hardly enough to keep me functional and alive. To my mild surprise, it was far easier to discuss my magic here than it had been back on that riverbank in Gunma. Perhaps it was the comfort of familiar surroundings, perhaps it was Naoto's famous charisma. More likely, it was the benefit of explaining things a second time. It was easier to sort the background out into a rational and ordered flow, instead of a half-panicked tumult. The fact that Ogi didn't call me a witch also helped. Now that I think about it, he took it remarkably in stride. After I joined the Kozuki organization, and more importantly after I started eating significantly more food with higher caloric yields, the energy reserves that I draw from for my magic expanded, increasing both the strength and variety of effects I could manifest. Admittedly, just correlation, but that trend continued and expanded after Ogi mandated specific shared meal times and increased portion sizes. That should explain why I didn't strike the various gangsters dead back in the day. And now to explain why I'm not using my abilities to push the Britannians into the sea single-handedly. Even now, it's still not particularly impressive. Those flames, for example, took a significant portion of my available energy. I shrugged, trying to diffuse any disappointment via a commiserating "what can you do about it?" expression. It's frankly most useful the way I have been using it, as a way of boosting my own capabilities. It's got a few other minor tactical applications. Unfortunately, it's too weak to really make a difference in the greater scheme of things. I jumped in my seat, startled despite myself at the loud impact. Naoto was standing, leaning forward across the table on the hand that he'd just slapped down onto the surface. "Are you even listening to yourself?" I leaned back, away from my suddenly crazed leader. A medley of expressions whirled across Naoto's face, too fast to pin down: anger, shock, hope, amusement, and just a hint of disappointment. Then, he blinked, seemed to notice my reaction, and coughed slightly with embarrassment at his outburst. "Tanya," Naoto began, twisting away to scoop up his fallen chair, righting it, and sitting back down before leaning back across the table. He leaned forward, lowering his head so he was directly at my eye height, and took one of my hands in his. "Tanya, you are an incredibly intelligent, and incredibly capable person. I respect your accomplishments. Your plans and ideas have done so much to help so many already, and I'm sure you're only getting started. But, here? About this? You're wrong." It was my turn to blink with surprise and confusion, and I'm sure I would have leaned back in my seat if Naoto hadn't already captured my hand. The sudden whirlwind of compliments was flattering, but What does he mean? I'm wrong. Without a focus, my magic is incredibly weak. I can't melt a nightmare with a handful of fire. Even if I had a computational orb, a single aerial mage against the Britannian army is suicide. Before I could express my rebuttal, Naoto started talking. Weak or not, Tanya, you can do magic. Magic. Nobody else can, nobody I've ever heard of, at least. It's a sign that you are important, he laughed. Not that we didn't already know that, of course. A moment later, Naoto sobered up and continued, his tired eyes lit from within with a fervor I already disliked. It's like the old stories, an evil army of demons comes to a peaceful land, and conquers the people. The people cry out for a hero, and from their midst, an orphan emerges. And her bravery is recognized by Kami, who gives gifts marking that girl as a hero. He smiled, a wry twist to his lips. I did say that you'd done Amaterasu's work when you smote the thugs in the station with fire and steel, didn't I? This looks like proof that I was more right than I ever could have suspected. I have no idea what my face looked like, as I gaped at Naoto, but I could only assume horror-stricken would have been an apt description. His reaction was one I hadn't even imagined, yet was somehow far worse than any I could have expected. I should have seen this coming. All the signs were there. He references the gods far more often than is healthy. Whatever my reaction had been, it clearly hadn't been what Naoto expected either. His eyebrows rose in surprise, and he quickly started speaking again, this time taking a different tact. Look, whether or not the kami have blessed you isn't important, but the idea that you could have been is. I'm not trying to be cynical here. Way back when we were first recruiting, you said that it's important to give people some reason to hope that tomorrow will be a better day, and that giving people something to fight for would make them more willing to fight over the long haul, right? We've already started that by giving them food and stuff, but they need a symbol, something to really rally behind. I clenched my teeth and endured the sting of having my own words thrown back in my face. Dealing with fanatics was annoying even at the best of times. Even when I could safely ignore the ranting, simply encountering people who had chosen to forsake rationality for overwhelming dedication to their pet obsession reduced the quality of my day. Unfortunately, I couldn't ignore this situation in the hopes that cooler heads would prevail. Naoto was the leader of my organization, and now the political head of Shinjuku. There were no cooler heads who could force the genie back into the bottle. I can't believe I almost missed Shugal, even for a moment. Once the word starts getting out, the people of Shinjuku and the Japanese outside the Ghetto will rally to us. Naoto continued his pitch, trying to convince me of the wisdom of his wild idea. We have lots of recruits already, but they're all from Shinjuku too. If we can spread the word outside the walls, who knows what kind of opportunities we'll get. We might be able to finally get clear of the 6 houses, get clear of that treacherous piece of shit at the school. If the people truly believe that the gods are with us, they'll flock to our banner. We'll push Britannia back into the Pacific, hell, we'll push them all the way back to Area 7. Naoto. Are you sure about that? Naoto and I both jumped slightly in our seats with astonishment, and turned in unison towards Ogi. I had been so overwhelmed by Naoto's lunatic reaction to my magic that I'd completely forgotten about the other man in the room, and judging by Naoto's reaction, he'd forgotten we weren't alone as well. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'd love to see Britannia smashed like any man, but... Ogi smiled apologetically, and gestured at our surroundings, but our people don't have that kind of power. Not right now. I've been out in the countryside, Naoto, outside of Shinjuku and Tokyo. Things aren't that much better out there. In some ways, they're actually worse. Thank you, Ogi. Thank you. The man had injected a moment of logic into the stream of zealotry, and had bought me an opening. I pushed my advantage with every iota of ruthless efficiency I could summon. Ogi is correct, Naoto. The spirit of our people may be strong, but it is also bloody, starving, and sweating under heavy burdens. A general uprising might lead to some temporary victories against the Britannians, but make no mistake, they would indeed be temporary. Naoto turned back towards me, but I pushed on, refusing to brook any interruption. This idea had to be ended here and now, for my sake and for the sake of everything that we were fighting for. I can't live a comfortable future if the Britannian Empire decides that 11s will have no future. Currently, Japan is under occupation by the garrison under the command of the vice-regal governor, Prince Clovis. This is not an active theater. The Britannians do not particularly care about Area 11, Both men winced at my use of the colonial label, as I'd intended. They do not care, and so only inferior forces are assigned here, for the most part. Second-rate garrison troops and embarrassments only, no elite units or knights of the rounds. I paused to let that implicit dismissal sink in, before continuing. However, the Britannians very much do care about the Sakuradite mines. The moment we threaten those, all bets are off. I saw the disbelief rising in Naoto's eyes, and quickly answered the implicit question before he could ask it himself. I am not saying we should give up the fight, and I'm not saying we should resign ourselves to Britannian domination. I am saying that it would be a betrayal of our people and of Japan to strike before we have a chance of not only liberating Japan, but guaranteeing a future for our people that lasts longer than a year. And a year's remarkably generous. Even if we did win control over the home islands, I'm sure the counter-assault would land in weeks. I could still see the passionate flames burning Naoto's eyes, but they had been somewhat dampened. Good, keep pressing. I took a breath, and exhaled the panicked anger that Naoto's rant had lit in my belly. Getting angry at Naoto would only make him angry in return. I liked and respected Naoto, this temporary bout of insanity aside, and I wanted him to respect me as well. More to the point, I had to continue to work with him in the future. I couldn't simply browbeat him into submission. I had to convince him that I truly was correct by appealing to his sensibilities. And if there's one thing that's truly fundamental to Kozuki Naoto's sensibilities, it's his role as the big brother looking out for his little sister. At every turn, Naoto had been motivated by his relationship to Kalen, and so, at least for a minute, I had to become the little sister. Naoto, I want a good and happy life for our people, I began, speaking in softer tones, and squeezing down lightly on the hand holding mine. I want a world where the next generation of children doesn't have to live like I did, and doesn't have to see the things I did. I want a Japan that is free, where I don't have to fight, and where I can do something productive instead. I let a degree of firmness re-enter my tone. But I've seen this path before, and I've heard the cries "one glorious push, and we'll force them out. The gods favor us." That's what the resistance groups always said, and it always ended the same way, a war and 100 dead Japanese for every dead Britannian. If the gods truly favored us, we would already be free. I squeezed down again on Naoto's hand, still lightly but again with a hint of firmness, and this time he let me go. The flames had dwindled down to scattered sparks. Besides, what happens if the word gets out, and the Britannians hear about it somehow before we're ready? Do you think that we're ready to hold Shinjuku against all comers? And, if the Britannians hear about my magic, what do you think they do to me, Naoto? The Britannians have always loved to talk about strong bloodlines. What do you think the nobles, to say nothing of the imperial family, would do for a magical bloodline? It was a dirty trick, but I didn't regret using it. I knew I had one, even before Naoto reluctantly nodded. You've got a point, Danya, he sighed, before ruefully laughing and resting his forward on his hands. Guess I really got ahead of myself there. I thought your magic would be a shortcut, and we could just use it to skip to the end of this. He sighed again, and halfway through it turned into a yawn. Over his head, Ogi and I exchanged a look and nod of acknowledgement. He really did look exhausted. Get sleep-deprived enough, and you might as well be drunk. I don't think there are any shortcuts here, Naoto, Ogi said, patting his friend and roommate's shoulder. Just a long hard slog, but... The former teacher looked back over at me, and then patted Naoto's shoulder again. I think we're up to the task, no matter how long that slog is. We've got each other, we've got our other comrades, and we've got the organization we've begun to build. I wasn't quite as sanguine about our prospects as Ogi seemed to be, but I nodded along anyway. No point in undermining a perfectly good pep talk, after all. Naoto collected himself a bit and sat back up in his chair, shooting Ogi a worn smile as his chair squeaked against the linoleum. Although, since we're on the topic, Ogi began, turning towards me with a curious expression, I've been wondering about your magic for quite a while now, Tanya. Do you think you're the only one who has it? And, do you think you can teach it to others? Naoto perked up at that, and likewise turned towards me, eyes alight with the same eager curiosity that had shown in Ogi's. I grimaced, but promptly replied. I have no idea if I'm the only one who has magic. I have no idea how I would detect it in other people, or if that's even possible. As for teaching, I paused for a moment, before shaking my head and continuing. I think I could probably explain how I use my magic, but I don't know how I could teach someone to get magic. It was disappointing to admit, and I could tell by my friends' matching crestfallen expressions that they had hoped for a different answer. Unfortunately, that was the answer I had for them. At the very least, I had the cold comfort of knowing that everything I had said was the truth, without even the slightest bit of prevarication. I didn't know if I was the only one in this world who had magic. Even in the world of my second life, mages in general had been uncommon and A or B class mages had been rare. I didn't know how to detect other mages without the use of specialized equipment that I had never studied and couldn't come even close to replicating. And as for teaching, I could explain my spell formulae, but I couldn't give magic to someone who lacked it. Before Naoto and Ogi could spend too much time mulling over my answer, my radio crackled to life, breaking the contemplative silence. "Train spotter to backpack, come in." Over. I looked at Naoto before I responded, both for courtesy's sake, and to show my continued respect for his leadership after resisting his ideas regarding my magic. As soon as he nodded, the handheld radio was at my mouth. "Backpack to train spotter, I hear you." "Sit rep." Over. Train spotter was one of the 2 fighters I'd assigned to guard the apartment building once they successfully infiltrated Shinjuku. Unless something had gone wrong, he should be 5 stories below me at this very instant. "Train spotter to backpack. Someone's here to see you. I think she's the one you designated as Cherry. Should I send her up?" Over. Naoto, who was clearly listening into my radio conversation, raised an eyebrow, silently asking who Cherry was. "Kalen's arrived, it seems," I answered his silent question by passing on the report, as if he hadn't been sitting only a few feet away. For some reason, his inquisitive eyebrow remained high on his brow, and I felt compelled to explain the code name I'd selected for his sister. "She's got red hair." "Cherries are red." It seemed like a fitting code name. "That's all." "Oh yeah, no argument here," Naoto replied, his inquisitive expression punctured as his mouth stretched wide with another barely suppressed yawn. "It's just an interesting choice for Kalen. She's a bit too spicy to be a cherry, and far too spiky to be a blossom." I thought it was a fitting name, I muttered, ignoring a knowing look from Ogi and also the flushed heat spreading across my cheeks as I pressed the transmission button back down. "Backpack to train spotter. Send her on up, and keep me posted if anyone else drops by." Backpack out. April 21, 2016 ATB, Shinjuku Ghetto, Tokyo Settlement. 1733. "Think she's the one you designated as Cherry? Should I send her up?" Over. The handheld radio chirped in the insurgent's hand as he released the transmit button. The ensuing static buzz was just another small source of irritation for Kalen Stadtfeld in a day already brimming with petty annoyances. The way that train spotter was smirking at her was another. Kalen could freely admit that he was a handsome man, and the sleeveless t-shirt he wore did an excellent job showcasing his powerful biceps, tanned almost to a nut brown from hours under the sun. If it were any other day, she might have enjoyed the man candy. But today, his smirking interest was just another annoyance, especially because Kalen apparently now needed his permission to go up the stairs to her brother's apartment. Ever since she'd gotten the text from Naoto letting her know that Tanya was back in town, seeing the younger girl again for the first time in months had been all Kalen could think about. She'd suffered through the bi-weekly meeting of the editorial staff of the Ashford Academy Gazette, doing her best to stay engaged with her fellow club members despite her eagerness to leave. As soon as the clock ticked over to 4:30, she'd made a beeline to the maglev station, only to learn that the usual route to Shinjuku was undergoing scheduled maintenance. A circuitous train ride and an entry fee later, Kalen entered the Shinjuku ghetto for the first time in months. She honestly hadn't expected much of a change from her last visit to the last enclave of the Japanese in the Tokyo metropolitan area, apart from the seasonal sewage cooking and fermenting and gurgling almost clogged drains, instead of freezing in the gutters. Naoto, never the most communicative, had become downright taciturn over the last few months. Her brother had all but ordered her not to come to the ghetto, though the texts expressing that order had couched that command in encouragement to focus on her studies and her budding career as a string reporter instead. While Kalen had resented the command to stay in the Britannian concession, she'd initially gone along with it. Naoto was, after all, her superior in the organization, as well as her big brother. Besides, she'd had plenty of work to do, even if it was very unsatisfying compared to the adrenaline rush of combat. Tanya and Naoto had both pointed out to Kalen that nobody else could do what she could. At first, Kalen had been happy for the reassurance. Now, she only wished that she was a bit more replaceable. When the texts from Naoto had slowly tapered down from once a week to once every few weeks, Kalen had begun to grow worried. To make matters worse, her mother was also getting increasingly worried for, and angry at, Naoto. His complete lack of communication was driving her up the wall, and so she had taken to asking Kalen about her brother whenever the two had a moment alone. It took much of Kalen's limited supply of patience not to vent her irritation on her mother. Their rebuilt relationship was still new and somewhat fragile, and Kalen privately feared backsliding into the Britannian Tanya had called her out as. Despite her resolve to be a better daughter, Kalen knew that her patience was far from endless. Before her willingness to wait snapped completely, she had approached the only person in the Britannian concession that she knew Naoto couldn't avoid. Ino, who was still running the Rising Sun communal dinners every Friday night at the refugee camp set up for the honorary Britannians in Toshima. Ino had been surprised to see her, but Kalen had come prepared with a good reason to drop by. Nobody else was reporting on the miniature refugee crisis happening right in the middle of the Tokyo settlement, so Kalen was stepping in to fill the niche. Ino, of course, hadn't been fooled by the earnest explanation, and had promised to smack Naoto when she got back to Shinjuku for her. Kalen was delighted by the promise, but not as much as she was at the news that her brother was alive, working hard, and making great progress with the tasks left in his care by Tanya. Kalen hadn't pressed for further details. Even that short conversation in potentially hostile territory had been a risk, and Kalen knew that if Tanya had been there she would have chided her over the breach of information security. So it had come as a great surprise when Kalen had entered Shinjuku and found the stench of sewage almost completely absent. While that was perhaps the most welcome change, it was less impressive than the amount of obviously fresh construction. Everywhere she looked, once cracked tenement walls sported fresh cement patches, and roads glistened under fresh layers of asphalt. More importantly, the people of Shinjuku were just as changed as the district itself. Young people moved with straight backs and squared shoulders, even as they struggled with heavy loads. Exposed concrete and years of graffiti were being painted over by several teams of paint-can-wielding elders and children. A young man missing one leg below the knee sat on the stoop of a building, mending a pile of torn clothes with a darting needle and thread, but his eyes were lively and bright as he worked, chatting with one of the elderly people spreading whitewash on a wall. Compared to the slouching, aimless crowds Kalen had pushed her way through during her previous trips to visit Naoto, these people all moved with energy and purpose. Everybody seemed busy with something, but nobody had the keen edge of desperation or fear that had once seemed omnipresent in Shinjuku. More surprising than the change in attitude was how armed Shinjuku had become. Despite the Britannian prohibition on the Japanese ownership of weapons, blades and cudgels were plentiful in the streets of Shinjuku. Everywhere Kalen looked she saw small groups of men and women, all wearing identical red headbands and sporting knives, batons, and at least 2 pistols per group. Kalen would have thought the clusters of armed people simply another gang, except that she had seen those same headbands worn by some of the volunteers that accompanied Ino to the communal dinners. On second glance, the pedestrians thronging the street didn't treat the headband-clad people with the wariness and fear typical to interactions with gangsters. They were treated with respect, yes, but it was the kind of respect that Kalen recognized from her relationships with most of her comrades in the organization, a mutual respect built on shared goals, experiences, and bonds. A mutual respect, indeed a camaraderie, that Kalen certainly wasn't feeling at the moment. Instead, she could almost feel the pressure of the gazes and sideways looks. Nobody troubled her, nobody even approached her, but the way the eyes of every headband-wearing tough followed her as she made her way down the once familiar streets was grating. Not that it's a huge surprise, since I'm probably the only natural redhead in Shinjuku apart from Naoto. It was annoying, seeing how much of a stranger she had become amongst her people. Kalen had spent months on the other side of the wall, living the life of the Britannian that she knew she wasn't. While she had been gone, the world inside the ringing walls of the ghetto had moved on, and now she was left gawking like a tourist. Much as she wanted to put all the blame for her newest degree of separation from the rest of the Japanese on Naoto, Kalen was guiltily certain that she could have pressed for updates harder if she had really cared. On the other hand, she shouldn't have had to tell Naoto to keep her in the loop in the first place. Absent Tanya's presence, it was clear to Kalen that Naoto had fallen back on old habits, The moment he'd had the chance, her big brother had wrapped her up in cotton and put her away in Ashford, safe and sound, while he had apparently built an army, conquered at least part of Shinjuku, and started rebuilding the place. He'd grown canny. Instead of directly denying her the chance to help, he had kept her focused on the tasks Tanya had left behind before herring off into the wilds of central Honshu. Now, after delays caused by pointless meetings, overdue railway maintenance, and her own distracted fascination at Shinjuku's metamorphosis, Kalen was being kept from welcoming her best friend back home and from giving her beloved big brother a piece of her mind by this idiot with a radio. Even worse, she was a full hour late to her reunion with a person who adored organization and loved timeliness. That's not fair, she thought to herself, fuming as the bastard's knowing smirk widened. He is just doing what Tanya told him to do. The radio and all these code names have her fingerprints all over it. So, you're the commander's cherry girl, huh? Kalen's eyes narrowed into slits as she glared at the fool in front of her. Irritatingly, the anger just seemed to confirm something for the ape, and his smile broadened. The temptation to punch him in the throat was nearly overwhelming, but Kalen kept her anger tightly leashed, as Tanya had taught her to do. They're on my side, after all, or at least Tanya's, Kalen reminded herself, keeping her hands open and relaxed at her sides, so let's keep it friendly. Letting her face slide into the contours of her typical school mask, Kalen injected just a hint of Millie's infuriating smirk into her smile and channeled her stepmother's haughty arrogance as she angled her head just enough to look down on the taller man. What? Are you jealous? Don't worry, I'm sure a gorilla like you will find a girlfriend eventually. The man grinned back with irritating ease. Thanks Cherry, I appreciate the support. Sorry to get your hopes up, but I like him a bit older. Come back in a few years and if Kaho hasn't kicked me to the curb yet, I'll give you a date or two. The draconic anger that laid deep in her bones stirred slightly, but Kalen was mostly just amused. Now that the initial exchange was past, she recognized this as a dynamic she'd had in the past with Tamaki, playful taunting and teasing, without any real emotional stakes. Well, if she doesn't kick you to the curb, I'd be happy to give it a try. You guys just got back from the training camp with Commander Backpack, right? Train Spotter narrowed his eyes slightly at her. Next to him, his silent partner's hand drifted towards the butt of his holstered pistol. What if we were, huh? Who's asking? Cherry. Kalen replied with a grin that she didn't even have to force. Her previously overwhelming annoyance had surprisingly melted away. Shooting the shit for a second with people whom she was confident were on her side had let her forget for a precious moment about how pissed she was at Naoto. It had been way too long since she could just relax and talk to someone without carefully watching her words. You know, the person you were obviously told to look out for? Kalen scoffed, before adopting a theatrically pompous tone. Don't you know who I am? I am the foremost student of the tiny terror of Shinjuku herself. The one you call Backpack. The two men chuckled and relaxed, the brewing tension dissipating. Trainspotter's face returned to its easy grin and his partner's hand continued to drift right past the pistol and settled on his hip, where he made a show of scratching himself. No shit, really? Trainspotter laughed. So you know what she's about, yeah? Hope you enjoyed the months off. She's probably gonna put you in a refresher course or some bullshit. Before Kalen could respond, Trainspotter's radio crackled back to life. Backpack to Trainspotter. Send her on up, and keep me posted if anyone else drops by. Backpack out. Trainspotter nodded towards the door to the stairwell. You know the way up, right? Kalen nodded back, and he grinned in reply. Head right on up. Thanks, Kalen replied, heading up the stairs. Once I finish up here, we should have a spa. I'd love to see how badly Tanya's standards have been slipping, without me and Big Bro keeping her on the straight and narrow. The stairwell door swung shut on the jeering reply from Trainspotter and the laughter from his partner. As she made her way up the flight of stairs, Kalen let the smile subside, schooling her face back into a more businesslike expression. Away from the impromptu distraction provided by the two guards, Kalen's anxiety began to make itself known again. Instead of worrying about Naoto's well-being, Kalen found herself focusing on how she described the events of the last few months to Tanya. It felt like she had plenty to report, but little of real significance. She could only hope that her best friend and mentor wouldn't be too disappointed in her. Tanya was always very hardworking, and pushed everybody around her to be equally diligent. Compared to what Tanya had likely accomplished in a season away, Kalen found it hard to be confident in her own meager achievements. As Kalen approached the apartment door, she took a deep breath and tried to let the worry flow out from her. Whether or not Tanya would be disappointed in her, whether or not Tanya would be happy to see her again. It was too late to change anything. Before her resolution could desert her, Kalen reached out and knocked on the splintered surface of the door. A moment later, a deadbolt slid home and the apartment door swung open. "Hey there, Kalen. Good to see you again." Her brother's best and oldest friend stood framed in the door, smiling at her from beneath his familiar pompadour. While Ogi's smile and hair were just the way Kalen remembered, he now sported the same farmer's tan as Train Spotter did 3 floors below. Although his nose is still peeling. "That's Scotwich." "Ogi." Kalen hastily bobbed a perfunctory bow in greeting before stepping close and pulling the former teacher in for a hug, which he returned with a fond smile. "It's so good to see you again." She squeezed him one more time, to which Ogi reacted with a theatrical groan before she released him and stepped back. "How was your trip? Did you get back okay? Did you have any problems?" Hey, slow down, slow down." Ogi held up his hands defensively, warding off the storm of questions. "Everything went fine, but what are you still doing out in the hallway? Come on in, Kalen." He stepped back into the room and to the side, and Kalen slipped in after him, closing the door as she passed, and froze in place as she took in the sight of the other 2 occupants. Ogi had changed over the last few months. Beyond the tan skin, Kalen had felt firm muscles under his unseasonal jacket, presumably hard-won over the course of endless days of training that she was desperately curious to hear more about. However, in comparison to both her brother and her best friend, Ogi had remained all but untouched by the passage of time. Tanya was on her feet, facing Kalen, and for some reason slightly red-faced. Kalen could only hope that she hadn't been arguing with Naoto, who was still seated at the table. The other girl looked just as eye-catching as always, although Kalen found herself somewhat of 2 minds about her own newly acquired tan. The longer hair was fetching, but more importantly the lean muscles clearly visible along Tanya's bare arms were a sign of significant improvement in Tanya's constitution as well as her strength. If her body was getting enough nutrients to grow at least 3 inches taller while having enough surplus to build muscle, it seemed like her days as a half-starved sack of bones were well and truly behind her. In Kalen's opinion, the development couldn't possibly have come soon enough. Naoto, by contrast, looked awful. In 3 months he had aged a decade, and looked like a man on the brink of bidding his 30s a reluctant farewell. His face was crusted in stubble, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, and his hair, as red as hers, hung lank and greasy halfway to his shoulders. Most worryingly of all to Kalen, his eyes seemed to look through her for a moment, before suddenly snapping back into the present and onto her face. He hastily forced a smile onto his face and she followed suit, cursing herself internally as she did so. Damn it. Damn it, damn it, damn it. I knew he was overworking himself, and who knows what else. He always does that, and then he forgets to look out for himself. I should have come down here months ago. Fuck, I should have brought Mom down here months ago to slap some sense back into him. Uck, I'm such a horrible sister. Ruthlessly forcing down the wave of anger at her stupid wannabe martyr of a big brother and her own spinelessness, Kalen stepped forward into the studio's small living area and scooped her friend up into a warm hug, skipping the customary bow and apparently taking Tanya by surprise, judging by the minute squeak. A moment later, a pair of slim arms snaked around Kalen's back as Tanya returned the hug. Happy birthday, Kalen. Tanya muttered. I am sorry to report that I didn't think to get a gift for the occasion. Smiling at the blonde's overly formal tone, Kalen responded in kind, affecting a nasal Pendragon-style noble accent not unlike her stepmother's. And a happy birthday to you, Commander Tanya. You're 12 now, correct? She chuckled, and squeezed another small squeak out of the other girl before releasing her and stepping back a pace. Congratulations on another year. I've got a sack of ground beans straight from Area 6 back at the manor with your name on it. Tanya's crystal blue eyes opened comically wide, and Kalen had to resist the urge to laugh at her enthusiasm. The poor girl's probably been coffee-less for months. Thank you for your gift, Kalen. You did an excellent job picking it out. Tanya's brow abruptly furrowed as she scowled ferociously up at Kalen, but her eyes still glittered with pleasure and amusement. Don't think you can bribe your way out of your report, though. Same old Tanya, always trying to be professional. It kinda makes her look a bit silly sometimes. Silly and kinda cute. Wouldn't dream of it. Kalen replied, giving in to her darkest impulses in front of such an adorable menace and tousling Tanya's sunny head. Tanya's scowl deepened, but she made no attempt to evade Kalen's hand, stoically enduring the head pats even as her blush darkened and deepened. Seeing her clear embarrassment, Kalen abruptly felt ashamed of herself and jerked her hand away from Tanya's surprisingly soft hair. What the hell, Kalen? You don't like it when Millie touches you, so why would Tanya like you touching her? Aware of the sudden shameful heat spreading across her own cheeks, Kalen desperately tried to find a way to exit the suddenly awkward situation. A second later, her gaze landed on her brother, and she abruptly remembered that she was supposed to be angry at him. Oh, remembered that, did you? An inner voice jeered as Kalen's blood started to heat back up. You've been stewing on it for months, and it went right out the window. And isn't anger so much easier to deal with? You know how to be angry, after all, you've been angry for years. Since Daddy abandoned you and then came back years later like it was all okay. I'll start my report as soon as I've given my brother the friendly greeting he's definitely earned. Kalen snarled, forcing that hateful nagging voice that sounded amazingly like her stepmother back down. Ignoring Tanya's sudden look of confusion, Kalen stalked past the girl and over to the table, dropping down into the empty seat across from Naoto. Hey there, sis, Naoto smiled as he greeted her. He sounded a bit raspy, but his voice was still strong. Surprisingly, something about it reminded Kalen of their father. And just like Dad, he's trying to push me away and leave me alone. Damn it, Naoto. Kalen took a breath, but found the calming technique didn't reduce her anger in the slightest. It did, however, chill the molten rage she felt at Naoto running off to endanger his life yet again while insisting she remain safe and secure in the manner that certainly wasn't home to the Stadtfeld family, to say nothing of the Kozukis. I bet you didn't think about Mom at all when you decided to work yourself to death, did you? Kalen began, ignoring his greeting. I'm sure there were always very important things to do instead of sleeping, and surely taking the time to shower and eat would have led to the final victory of Britannia. Taking another breath, Kalen continued her tirade, venting 3 months of worried anger and loneliness. You promised me, Naoto. You promised me you'd treat me like an adult and stop trying to leave me safe at home. You promised me I'd be a part of this. And then you just dropped off the map for almost 3 months. Ino only ever gave me the big picture, but even then I still knew you were risking your life and overworking yourself, just like always. Abruptly as always, Kalen's anger burnt itself out, leaving her with the ashes of numbing grief and a sense of emotional exhaustion. I can't stay angry at him. He's worked himself to the bone for months for Japan, and for me and Mom, but why didn't you ask me for help? Kalen asked, voice low and uncomfortably husky. Why don't you ever ask me for help? What the hell is the point of winning our freedom if you're not there to enjoy it with me, big bro? I know I had my own work, but I could have helped out, somehow. And Mom's worried sick, Naoto. First you didn't call when the Christmas thing went down, and then you didn't call her for the next 4 months. You haven't visited her since October, Naoto. After a moment, Naoto slowly reached out across the table and took one of Kalen's hands between his own. Kalen was tempted to jerk her hand away from her brother, to reject his touch, but the angry impulse faded away almost immediately. His hands were surprisingly cool against her own, considering how warm the apartment still was in the heat of the late afternoon. Naoto swallowed slightly before continuing, his speech slow and slurred slightly with fatigue. I'm sorry, Kalen. I'm sorry that I didn't keep you informed, and I'm sorry that I've been so crap at reaching out to communicate. And I'm sorry that I've been leaving you and Mom alone for so long. I'll have to reach out to her, see what I can do. Almost convulsively, Naoto closed his eyes and swallowed hard, throat visibly working as he sought to master himself. Kalen felt an urge to comfort him, but held fast in her resistance. She reminded herself, still angry with him. It was hard to remember that anger when she felt his hand squeeze hers for a moment before relaxing. Did his hands always shake like that? Just as the younger Kozuki was starting to get a bit worried about what was going on in her idiot brother's head, his eyes flickered open. The tiredness was still there, but below it was a familiar firmness, the same that she remembered from childhood arguments when she tried to follow her brother out into the streets at night. Her heart sank slightly. She had never managed to convince Naoto to let her follow him into danger back then either. But I am not sorry about leaving you out of my work in Shinjuku, Kalen. I should have kept talking to you. You're right, I screwed up. But you and I both had jobs to do, and both of them were important. The money your articles brought in was crucial. Naoto's voice was unyielding and unhurried as he presented his case. It was, Kalen realized, like hearing her father speak when he had made up his mind about something, a statement almost more of inevitabilities than possibilities. Implacable tone or not, Kalen wasn't intimidated by Naoto's attempt to crib notes from their father's speech patterns and try to interrupt, but Naoto rolled right over her attempt to voice an objection as he continued to speak. You want to be treated like an adult, right? Well, this is what it looks like, Kalen. You don't like your job? Tough. There's nobody else who has the right background or connections, so you don't have much of a choice. I can find plenty of people who are just as good or better than you at fighting. I can't find anyone else who can listen to bratty nobles gossiping without suspicion, or who can put sympathetic stories out into the Britannian media environment. Well, what about finding someone to take care of you, Naoto? Kalen shot back, yanking her hand free of her brother's grasp as she angrily came to her feet, hands planted on the table and leaning over her still-seated brother. Did you think about that, huh? Look at you, you're a fucking mess. Everybody I saw coming into Shinjuku looked like they'd gained weight since I was last here, but you look like you've lost 10 kilos, and you didn't have much to lose to begin with. Any concerns Kalen might have had about making a scene in front of Tanya and Ogi had been shattered by Naoto's seeming inability to understand just how fucking concerning it was to watch your beloved older brother work himself to death. You fucking idiot, big bro. Don't you see you're risking your life here? How the fuck are you gonna help Japan if you're too weak to lift a gun? What the fuck do you think I'd do if you died, you stupid idiot? Anything for the cause. Anything for a free Japan. Isn't that right, Kalen? Naoto smiled wryly up at Kalen as he threw Tanya's words, the phrases that had served as her mantra through the endless annoyances of Ashford Academy, back in her face. Every hour our people are enslaved is 1 hour too many. A few sleepless nights isn't so heavy a price to pay. It was, in Kalen's opinion, a low blow to invoke the logic Tanya had used to convince her to stay in Ashford in their current fight. I just want you to take care of yourself and let me help you, you fool. Can't you see that? Before she could say, or more accurately scream, her thoughts right back into Naoto's face, both Kozuki siblings were distracted by the flat crack of an open hand slapping down on the table between them. As one, both Kozukis turned and looked at the very unimpressed blonde standing next to them. Now that I have your attention, Tanya began, looking from Naoto to Kalen and back, please wrap up this touching family reunion and get to your report, Kalen. Internally cursing her fair skin once again as she felt the radiant heat of embarrassment spread across her cheeks and neck, Kalen coughed and straightened up, looking away from both Tanya and Naoto. Fine, I think I've made my point. She hesitated for a moment, but turned back to Naoto and muttered, it's good to see you again, big bro. Looks like you've accomplished a ton. Good work. Naoto smiled at her, leaning back in his chair and slouching into a more relaxed position as the tension eased. Thank you, Kalen. I know you've been really busy too, so how about you tell Tanya all about the progress you've made? Accepting the implicit peace offering, Kalen lowered herself back into her seat as Tanya joined them at the table. She had to focus. Now that all the pleasantries, including a chat with Big Bro, were done with, Kalen closed her eyes. I have a job to do. Letting herself sink fully into her insurrectionist persona for the first time in months, she mentally peeled away all other aspects of her character, sister, daughter, diligent student and junior reporter. Trying to return to the purity of purpose she'd felt standing in that gruesome subway station, to the moment when Tanya had demanded the deaths of everybody who still drew breath. I am a professional, doing whatever I must for the cause. Japan will live again. The revolutionary opened her eyes, and nodded towards her commander. Over the last 3 months, I have made significant inroads into the student social scene of Ashford Academy, in large part due to association with the Ashford Gazette. I have further deepened my connection with rivals Cardimund and worked to bring him deeper into the Rising Sun's fold. Unexpectedly, improving my relationship with him has also boosted my social status at the academy. Tanya's eyes sharpened with interest, and she unconsciously leaned slightly in towards Kalen. I was under the impression that Mr. Cardimund was the ne'er-do-well son of minor nobility. But if associating with him is improving your public profile, there must be more to him than meets the eye. Just so, Kalen nodded. In fact, it turns out that Cardimund isn't even his real name. Apparently, his parents despise each other, and he sided with his mother and took her maiden name. Despite this lack of family unity, he somehow got onto the student council as the secretary. Kalen suddenly hesitated, realizing that Tanya probably didn't understand why that was important or surprising. She didn't even get to the 6th grade before the conquest, so there's no way she'd know what an ordinary student council does, much less understand Ashford's true center of power. Though why does this logic sound so hollow here? Anyway. So, Kalen began, speaking slowly as she tried to explain why a group of students had so much power without sounding silly. In most schools, the student council isn't very important. They mostly handle extracurricular matters, school events, and maybe some light administrative work. At Ashford Academy, Millie Ashford is the council president, and since she's the principal's granddaughter, she can more or less do as she pleases. Which means that the council can open or shut clubs, dole out discretionary budgets, proclaim new events on a whim, even disrupt classes if she pleases. Kalen paused for a moment, then decided to hammer the point home. Sitting on the council is a big deal, which makes rivals being involved a surprise. Honestly, that doesn't even begin to cover it. If push comes to shove, they've got more authority than the teachers themselves. The principal indulges Millie way too much. So, Tanya began, frowning in concentration, this student council has real power, despite being populated by students, and somehow a social non-entity like Mr. Cardimund ended up on the board. And because of his prestigious position, as well as his access to the budgets, you are benefiting from being publicly associated with him? Partially, Kalen nodded. He also has a generally friendly personality, and seems to know everybody to one degree or another. So everybody knows and generally likes him in return. Unfortunately, my association with him hasn't been a complete plus. Kalen paused for a fortifying breath, and continued. So, it somehow got out that I was with him when he got hurt. Worse, he must have told someone all about our trip on Christmas, because everybody knows that I was the one responsible for him being in the honorary Britannian district on Boxing Day in the first place. Judging by your lack of urgency, I assume that your cover is still intact despite this? Tanya inquired, raising a dispassionate eyebrow. Despite her cool tone, Kalen could detect a faint note of concern. Phew. She's not angry. Yes. No need to worry about that. Kalen confidently replied. No, the real problem with that information getting out was Millie, just like it always is with anything that happens in that damned academy. It turns out that Miss President didn't like having one of her private toys damaged. Kalen hesitated, torn between her dislike of the Ashford heiress and her duty to report what she had seen to her leader as accurately as possible. After a moment, her duty won out, and the student insurgent reluctantly admitted the truth. Actually, that's not quite right. As much as I don't want to give her any credit, I think my original opinion of Millie might have been wrong. Partially. She is definitely a spoiled brat who has no idea how good she has it. She's way too handsy, and she loves manipulating people, so she's definitely a Britannian noble. But, Kalen sighed, irritated with herself as well as the absent noble. Damn it. I hate being wrong. But she really does seem to care about the students at her family's school. At least, she hedged, when she's not the one messing with them. Shortly after the new year, Kalen had dropped by the student council's clubhouse to drop off some forms regarding the school paper's budget. Almost the instant she had entered the council's meeting room, Kalen had come face to face with Millie Ashford. The blonde's typical leering smile was nowhere to be seen, and before she knew what was happening, Kalen found herself maneuvered into a side room for a quick chat over tea. The ensuing interrogation had been surprisingly competent and thorough. For the first time, Millie hadn't made a single joke or a pass at Kalen, and had kept her wandering hands by her sides. While the lack of casual sexual harassment had been a welcome surprise, Kalen found that she almost preferred it to the icy formality. I never realized that being called Lady Stadtfeld could feel less comfortable than hot stuff. Uck. After serving tea without so much as bothering to ask how Kalen took it, 2 sugars, isn't it? No need to bother, I already know, Millie had, in the politest terms possible and with the cold confidence of a queen on her throne, demanded an explanation. "Did you have any idea what you were doing, Lady Stadtfeld?" Despite the blonde's perfect genteel poise, little finger primly extruded as she sipped from her cup, Kalen was somehow intimidated. "I suspect not. After all, what finely bred lady would knowingly hare off to a violence-racked common neighborhood with only a fellow student for company?" The cup had clicked against the bone-white china saucer, and Kalen fought the anger that instinctually rose to counter her worry. "Either you are not a true noble daughter of Britannia," the insinuation hung in the air like the sword of Damocles, "or you acted in a singularly foolish manner. Which was it, Lady Stadtfeld?" Kalen had answered truthfully and told Millie that she had known that some honorary Britannians had been attacked, and that she had seen the smoke rising, but she hadn't known how intense the violence had been. She had been equally truthful in stating that she certainly hadn't intended to expose rivals to anything like the aftermath of a murder, leaving out the detail that the exposure had been a net positive for her and an unexpected bonus to bringing rivals along with her. "So you truly were a fool." The rebuke had cut surprisingly deep. For a moment, it wasn't Millie chiding Kalen for her choices, but the faceless lady-in-waiting who had tutored her in noble etiquette and conduct on the orders of her father. Thankfully, Millie had decided to believe her protestations that she hadn't expected anything along the lines of a public lynching. Instead, the student president had settled for explaining how unhappy she was with the risk to members of her student body, and with how concerned she was about rivals, who apparently was having trouble sleeping now. Kalen had made the appropriate noises of concern and sympathy, trying her best to indicate her submission and contrition until the Ashford heiress's harangue finally wound down. Just as the tea had grown cold and Kalen had been certain that the conversation was over, Millie had managed to well and truly undermine Kalen's understanding of her character. While the head of the student council was just as cold and formal as she had been throughout their little tete-a-tete, she had rather directly asked Kalen if she was okay in the aftermath of her experience, and if she needed any legal or medical help. "Fool or not, you're a student of Ashford as well, Lady Stadtfeld," Millie pointed out, "and as the elected head of the student body as well as the granddaughter of the director, it is my job to make sure that you are happy, healthy, and ready to learn." Millie had reclined back into her chair, hands tented below her chin. "If you need help with anything, even the consequences of your own poorly thought-out actions, I'm here for you. Besides," a hint of Millie's usual smirk touched her face for an instant, "some mistakes can be pretty fun, just as long as you don't get caught." Initially, Kalen thought that this was another veiled threat, one too subtle for her to pick up, but Millie's concern had bled out around the icy noble mask. Plus, the fact that she just slipped up and made yet another sex joke makes it unlikely that she's actually some sort of social chess master. Kalen could only conclude that she was, in fact, sincere, and that somewhere along the way she had misunderstood Millie Ashford. She was still a pain in the ass, overly talkative and likely a pervert, but she wasn't the cold-hearted manipulator Kalen had thought she was. They had returned to the meeting room in silence. Kalen had quickly handed over the documents that had brought her to the clubhouse in the first place to Shirley Finette, the council's treasurer, before all but fleeing from the seat of Millie's power as quickly as she could without abandoning the pretense of ladylike behavior. "So, I managed to dodge any official punishment," Kalen summed up, "although Millie's been a bit distant since then. She was actually cold enough to me in public on a few occasions to get some idiots gossiping about what had happened between us, but after rivals started improving, she just got distant." Kalen shrugged, still not entirely sure how she felt about the development. On one hand, it meant Millie had stopped trying to grope her whenever they met. On the other, it was almost certain that Millie wouldn't be passing any information along, much less taking her into her confidences and giving her access to the Academy's files. Pity that. And just when Millie finally showed a trace of not being a complete bitch too. Fortunately, seeing something real for the first time in his life wasn't enough to scare rivals off. He approached me right before the first weekend in February and asked if the people from the neighborhood we'd visited still needed help, and if he could do anything. Rivals hadn't been subtle in his approach either. Just as Kalen had been making her way out of the science wing at the start of the lunch period, he had stepped out of the crowd of milling students and asked her whether or not the place they'd been at still looked like child garbage. The very public question had left Kalen momentarily shaken and unsure how to answer, and just like always, the younger Stadtfeld had immediately responded to uncertainty with anger. He was really lucky we were in public, or I might have knifed him, she admitted, shaking her head ruefully. I thought he was mocking me, or trying to make me look like a sympathizer in front of everybody. I mean, who asks something like that in front of an entire crowd of gossipy students, right? Kalen had thankfully managed to master her anger before she'd lashed out. She'd automatically uttered some vague platitude to publicly answer Rivals' question, hopefully heading off any curiosity from the onlookers, before making a bid for privacy by asking if he wouldn't mind joining her for lunch. The susurration of not-so-quiet whispers from the ring of students very deliberately not looking their way at the invitation had nearly been enough to set her off again, but fortunately Rivals' jerky nod of acceptance drew her attention back to the main priority, and to her mission. The lunch conversation had been a tense situation for all involved. Rivals had been twitchy and uncharacteristically irritable, and while Kalen was no longer as on edge as she had been early on in her career as a spy, the fear of discovery remained a constant companion. Neither ate well, picking at their respective meals as Kalen tried to fill Rivals in with as many details as she could without sounding suspiciously well informed. To her pleased surprise, not only did Rivals no longer look haunted by his month-old trauma, he seemed determined to truly join the organization he nominally headed in helping out the poor and destitute of Tokyo. I told him a bit about the rising sun, Kalen recounted, but since he was the first Britannian noble to actually take an interest, I also told him a bit about how the rot went way beyond just the public beatings and the mob violence. The noble half-Britannian shrugged, somewhat bashful under Tanya's approving look. It wasn't a hard sell. Everybody knows how corrupt some of the nobles are, since they don't bother hiding it. Anyway, Kalen continued briskly, while he definitely agreed that noble corruption was a problem, he didn't get how it related to what we'd seen. I explained that one of the Rising Sun's problems was getting enough money to pay the bribes we needed to get food and supplies to the honorary Britannians. He understood that easily enough. Handouts are universal, after all, but it took some effort to explain how the petty street-level stuff isn't the real issue. I mean, I hadn't really expected him to know that only Britannians could file permits for public assembly and food distribution with the Tokyo Settlement Administration, like what I did while setting the Rising Sun up, but it was difficult to explain to him why this was a problem. It had been a long conversation, one that extended beyond the lunch period and into a meeting in a cafe after school. Rivals' unflagging interest had been flattering, in an odd way. The usual goofy behavior slipped out now and again, but for the most part he had remained laser-focused on Kalen's descriptions of how the area's system was set up to hamstring any effort to improve the lives of any but the powerful. Teaching a Britannian noble to critically examine the society he had been raised in had been a novel experience for the half-Japanese girl as well. To her gratified surprise, while Rivals occasionally displayed the casual racism inherent to Britannian culture, he didn't seem to mean any of it particularly personally. Each time he had said something about the 11s, Kalen had pointed out that the honorary Britannians were of the same stock as the numbers, but by Rivals' own admission were hard workers and worthy citizens of Britannia. Thankfully, Rivals hadn't pushed back on these assertions, and had seemed preoccupied and thoughtful by the time Kalen had bid him goodbye. It was strange, Kalen admitted, meeting a Britannian who really seemed to want to help out. I don't know if he really got everything. I caught him staring at my chest a few times, and sometimes I think he was just nodding along, but he really seemed to want to help out. Nato looked vaguely murderous, bloodshot eyes narrowing with irritation. Did he do anything but look? Boy or not, noble or not, if he does, you tell me about it and what, deny the Rising Sun the benefits of having another Britannian agent, this one full-blooded, with money and access. Her professional persona slipped away for a moment as Kalen turned to her brother, unimpressed with his interruption. Even if he had, you were too busy not answering my texts to do anything. Besides, Mom told me all about what you and Ogi got up to in high school, so you've got no right to give me or Rivals any crap. Making a vague warning gesture, Nato leaned back in his chair, away from Kalen. All right, Geass. You know how to handle yourself, I got it. Just let me know if you need help or anything, okay? With a huff, Kalen turned back to Tanya and smiled apologetically. Anyway, I figured that having someone else on board who could help me purchase supplies would be a good thing. Besides, the fact that Rivals already has a driver's license meant that he could rent trucks too, further increasing his value. Not to mention his value as a high-value courier, Tanya mused, Between that motorcycle of his and his noble status, he would be highly mobile and likely above suspicion. Certainly not likely to be targeted for random harassment or searches, at least. That's a good idea, Kalen nodded, pleased that Tanya at least was focusing on important matters. But my greatest concern was frightening him off by dumping too much responsibility on him at once, so I started slow. I told him about the communal dinner coming up the next Friday and invited him to attend. I told him he could just help serve and maybe talk to the people who came, listen to what they had to say. That first meeting had set the hook. Rivals had been somewhat stiff and standoffish at the beginning of the dinner, an attitude somewhat reflected back by the honorary Britannians who were understandably wary of any strange Britannian appearing amongst them. Fortunately, as he'd grown more comfortable with dishing out the chicken and vegetable soup, Rivals had unbent, and by the end of the evening was eagerly helping out with the cleanup and chatting amiably with a number of honorary Britannians. He'd even gone as far as helping out a small boy with his Britannian homework, correcting grammatical mistakes and complimenting the kid on his handwriting. After the third meeting, I approached him for a potential interview for the Ashford Gazette. Despite her certainty that it had been a good idea, Kalen found herself feeling slightly apprehensive. It had been a risky decision for a number of reasons, and it could still blow up in their faces even now, months in the past. Considering his noble heritage, friendly personality, and social connections, I figured that Rivals would be a good tool for recruiting other potentially sympathetic Britannians. Besides, I hoped that having a relatively clean-cut young Britannian noble speaking on the record about the rising sun would help bring in donations. Realizing she'd begun to nervously accelerate, Kalen took a breath and forced herself to slow down. So far, Tanya hadn't shown any reaction to her decision, neither positive or negative. The almost feline inscrutability was getting under Kalen's skin, but she saw no other option but to plow on with her explanation. He agreed to the interview, and I wrote a nice puff piece around a few quotes. I made sure to emphasize his noble heritage and paternalistic motivations. I couched it all on the idea that since honorary Britannians are legally Britannian citizens, improving their lives will accelerate their integration into the area's culture and economy. Across the table, Tanya was still sphinx-like in her lack of expression. Kalen gulped slightly, and made her final push. And I took a picture of him patting one of the honorary Britannian kids on the head while I had the boy hold up his Britannian workbook up to the camera, complete with the mother thanking Rivals from the other side of the frame. Trying to emphasize the idea of the noble civilizing Britannian gentleman, you know, surrounded by the people he's teaching to be good Britannians. To Kalen's great relief, Tanya finally nodded. Just once, but enough to lift a weight from Kalen's shoulders. Yes, she's on board. Kalen hadn't been afraid of Tanya's wrath. The idea that her friend would actually get angry at her over a reasonable decision she'd made was laughable. The prospect of her best friend and mentor's disappointment had been, on the other hand, a real source of worry for Kalen since the day of the interview. Before Kalen could fully release the anxiety that had haunted her for the past 2 months, Tanya spoke up. You do realize, the leader of the Kozuki organization pointed out conversationally, that publicizing Mr. Kardiman's connection to the Rising Sun Benevolent Association, a charity group catering to Japanese and honorary Britannians, has likely demolished any future the boy might have had in any position of power, and may also have brought him to the attention of state security organizations? Yes, I do, Kalen replied firmly. And I've been planning for that question for weeks now. I also understand the danger that publicly connecting Rivals to the Rising Sun poses to both the Rising Sun, and to me personally. But I thought the risk was worth it, in part because of some factors that I don't think you've considered, Tanya. Well, you are the Britannian specialist here, the other girl mused, so you're probably correct about that. What factors am I missing, Kalen? First, you don't fully understand Britannia. Kalen hoped that statement hadn't been too confrontational. It hadn't sounded quite that aggressive when she'd recited it in her head. Too late now. I'm not trying to be insulting, she hedged, trying to walk back the extra assertiveness a bit, but your Britannian parent wasn't around when you were little and your only real exposure to Britannian culture before we met was through the school for 11s. So, you've really only seen Britannian culture from the outside and through propaganda. Tanya stilled for a moment, before nodding. I learned many things from the school for 11s, but few of them have proven to be true. She smiled slightly, and almost looked nostalgic. I think it was the only time I've ever been happy to be a blonde. Was that a joke? On the rare occasions Tanya wandered away down tangents, it was difficult to tell how seriously she meant anything that she said. While Kalen could usually pick up on the other half Britannian's frequently dry humor, the sometimes whimsical tone of her recollections made it tricky to tell the difference between sincerity and a subtle joke. Still beats the times she just stares off into space though. Anyway, Kalen pulled on through the awkward pause, determined to continue her explanation. Britannian culture is nowhere near as monolithic and united as the government makes it out to be, and I'm not even just talking about class stuff either. The Empire covers something like a third of the world, and Pendragon can't have eyes everywhere. There's lots of regional differences across the areas, some dating all the way back to before they were areas. Especially in the other new areas, like Area 10. And that's not even factoring in all the noble politics. Naoto butted in. The way father talks about it, there's lots of competition in the nobility, some of it tied to stuff like backing different noble or imperial heirs, some of it tied to more philosophical divides. Lots of the families that talk about the civilizing power of empire are just using ideology as a way of joining a court clique. Gotta talk the talk in public to really prove your membership. They're doing it for the same cynical reasons they do everything else. Access to power, signaling loyalty, all that bullshit. But, Naoto leaned forward, resting his arms against the table. While every noble's a bullshit artist, not all of them are purely liars. At least, not all the time. There are lots of nobles who truly believe in the Britannian burden to civilize the world, both here in Japan and back in the homeland, for one reason or another. Most nobles are cynical about that idea, but plenty are sincere enough to pony up cash to support charitable efforts. Plenty are sincere, but that doesn't mean that they don't have some sort of angle, Kalen muttered, snorting contemptuously. It's the old carrot and stick thing, and the purists have the stick all staked out. Plus, since the purists are all about keeping honorary Britannians out of the military, all of the other factions at court have a reason to keep up the honorary program. So that's where your donations came from? Tanya nodded, apparently answering her own question. That's very interesting indeed. Playing different noble factions off one another and using philanthropy as an instrument of political power. Tanya's voice tapered off, and for a moment she looked right through Kalen, before blinking and coming back. Please continue, Kalen. Emboldened, Kalen did just that. Second, I think that making Rivals' involvement public on our terms was beneficial for multiple reasons. If someone found the documents I'd filed with the administration and started wondering why Rivals wasn't bragging about sponsoring a charity for the social cachet, there could have been a problem. Also, if people thought he was trying to keep it quiet, they might have started wondering if it would be good blackmail material, which might have led to more people asking questions. Best way to deal with a trap is springing it on your own terms, Ogi opined, nodding approvingly at Kalen. Now people will just think he's just a young idiot trying to impress a girl through volunteer work, especially if he keeps being seen in public with our very own Lady Stadtfeld. Exactly. Also, having a Britannian face for the rising sun will likely lower suspicion about it in general. If everybody's thinking of it as a noble ego project, they won't notice that the rest of the organization's members are Japanese, numbers, not even honoraries. Kalen beamed at Ogi, happy enough that he'd seen where she was going to ignore his use of her official title. Rivals is also just a goofy enough guy that I think anybody looking into him will think that he's a fool. The fact that he actually is a fool will definitely help sell that impression. And then, they'll dismiss him and the rising sun as anything important. Naoto laughed at the last point. Harsh, little sister. There's no need to burn our illustrious chairman like that. Ignoring her brother, Kalen laid out the final, more personal reason she thought the danger was minimal. Third, I don't think that anyone's going to investigate me on just suspicion alone. Our family, she gestured at Naoto, are a bit more important than Rivals' family. Dad's got lots of friends, both here and back in the homeland. Nobody's going to mess with me unless they've got something more solid than student journalism. Not on my own account, at least. Dad might have some enemies. I dunno. Kalen shivered under Tanya's suddenly cold stare, and practically wilted with relief when that alien glare moved onto her brother, before freezing back up as it swung around to her. You know, Tanya mused contemplatively, there are plenty of questions which I'd like to have answers for in regards to your father, but it occurred to me that powerful men rarely enjoy having their secrets spread without their permission. Tanya's eyes, blue as the Pacific and equally cold, moved back to Kalen's brother. I have held myself back, partially out of that concern, but also out of the trust I have in both of you. That said, this latest move goes beyond passive intelligence gathering in the Britannian sphere. It touches on politics. Naoto, I trust you and your sister, but I cannot operate blindly here. Is there anything that I should know, or need to know, about your father? Naoto shot a quick look at Kalen, though Kalen didn't know what for, before turning back to Tanya and shrugging. He's ex-military, and apparently had a pretty good record before he retired. He hasn't told me much about his career, and I didn't ask before he left us the first time, or when he came back to bring Kalen into the fold. I know we've got some uncles and aunts back in the homeland that I've never met. I just know that they were the ones who pressured him to marry the bitch, even though he's the head of House Stadtfeld. He shrugged again. Apart from that, I dunno, he's pretty busy back in the homeland. Lots of irons in the fire. Who knows what he's up to? Something seemed to click behind Tanya's eyes. The glacial chill disappeared, replaced by a calculating stare that vanished almost instantly, masked by her typical expression of interested neutrality. I see. Very wise. What the hell did she just get from that? Kalen could only wonder what connection Tanya had come to from Naoto's comments. Hopefully she'll share whatever she just learned with me. Kalen, you were right. Kalen blinked at the blunt admission, and scrambled for an instant to figure out what Tanya was conceding. You had good reason to involve Mr. Cardimund in publicizing our group, and doing so forwarded our aims. I'll admit, you had a better grasp of the situation and its risks than I did. Please, she gestured, continue your report. Kalen took a moment, trying to remember where she'd been in her report before the tangent. Something about the interview. Ah, that's right. So, there was a dangerous moment at the fourth meeting Rivals showed up to. I thought he was busy helping out with the dishes, so I'd gone to check in with Ino about how things were going in Shinjuku, because someone Kalen glared at her brother for a moment, wasn't telling me anything. Unfortunately, Rivals finished cleaning up faster than I had expected, and he walked right in on our conversation. Our Japanese conversation. It had been a heart-stopping moment for Kalen, and probably also for Ino. They had gone a block down from the park where the weekly communal meal was served and around a corner to talk, but some helpful fool had pointed Rivals their way when he'd asked where Kalen had gone. It had been yet another of the many times Rivals had unknowingly avoided death at Kalen's hand. When Rivals had popped his head around a corner and asked what they were talking about, Kalen had frozen, trapped between the need to murder the interloping invader before he could blow her cover and the knowledge of the bloody revenge the murder of a friendly young noble would inspire. Caught between two deeply unpalatable choices, Kalen had unintentionally given Rivals the time he needed to unknowingly salvage the whole affair. Instead of accusing Kalen of rebel sympathies and vowing to go straight to Prince Clovis, Rivals had immediately and enthusiastically expressed his interest and admiration of Kalen's linguistic abilities. As he'd gushed on and pestered Kalen for Japanese vocabulary, Ino had faded into the background and slipped away back to Shinjuku with the rest of the Rising Sun volunteers. Looking back on it, I suspect showing interest in Japanese was part of his rebellion against his parents, Kalen hypothesized, since he also said something about how they didn't think that a young Britannian gentleman needed to learn any number mumbo-jumbo. It wasn't an uncommon point of view, and in all honesty, it wasn't entirely wrong. The number of Japanese speakers back in the homeland was probably very small. At the time, though, I thought it was some kind of trick, especially when he said you must really love the numbers, since you took the time to learn their lingo. It does have the hallmarks of an implicit threat, Tanya agreed. The accusation of sympathy for the conquered implies divided loyalties or perhaps weakness. Especially if his parents taught him that learning the language of the conquered is unbecoming of the nobility. That's what I thought, Kalen exclaimed, nodding in emphatic agreement. I mean, he only told me about the language thing later, but yeah, that's why I thought it was a threat. But funnily enough, his resentment for his parents is how I got out of that whole mess. I told him I'd be in big trouble if my mother learned that I knew Japanese and was using it out in public. Kalen grinned, still pleased with her cleverness. He was falling over himself to assure me that my secret was safe, and then started talking about his own relationship to his mother and all that. 10 minutes later, I think he'd forgotten about Japanese entirely. He hasn't mentioned it since then, and I haven't heard him say anything about it to anybody else. More importantly, blinking, Kalen twisted in her chair, looking away from Tanya and towards the other side of the table. For a moment, she'd forgotten that Naoto was still in the room, which was really a testament to how enthusiastic she had been about reporting her movements to Tanya. Now, her brother had straightened up from his exhausted slump and was bolt upright. And oh shit, he looks really pissed. Why is this the first time I'm hearing about any of this? One of your fellow students and our pet dupe knows that you speak Japanese? And nobody thought this was worth reporting to me before Tanya came back? That seems like a conversation you need to have with Ino, and perhaps with your other lieutenants. Tanya was calmer, but she didn't look happy either. Our organization is built on cooperation, mutual trust, and discipline. If Ino is acting insubordinate and keeping information from you, find out why and act accordingly. If you don't mind my opinion, Ogi jumped into the conversation, and since Ino isn't here to defend herself, I think she might have had a reason for not passing the information on to you. I'm not trying to disrespect you, Naoto, but you look rough. You even admitted to Kalen that you haven't been sleeping very much. So, you were underslept, you had a ton of work already to handle, and what, Ino tells you that someone might know something about your sister. Ogi shook his head, and patted his friend on the shoulder. Come on man, we both know you probably would have throttled the boy yourself, and then where would that leave us? Naoto sighed, and slumped back into his chair, rubbing his face. You've got a point. Fine, I'll be polite when I talk to Ino. She probably had her reasons. Either way, we can discuss this further at a later date. Concluding the digression, Tanya turned back to Kalen. Please, continue your report. Well, Kalen hesitated, taking a moment to remember where she'd been before resuming. Oh, right. The meeting. So, Ino had, via Kalen, set up a more formal meeting with the figurehead leader of the Benevolent Association to, as Ino had put it, now that he is involved, I'd best get a measure of the boy for myself. Since Ino could only understand Britannian if it was spoken slowly and simply and rivals of course couldn't speak any Japanese, Kalen ended up as a third at the small meeting, acting as an interpreter. The meeting had started off rather uncomfortably, Kalen explained to Tanya, partially due to the usual awkwardness of first introductions, partially because Ino had spent years in a ghetto due to the Britannian conquest and had lost friends, family, and all legal rights in the process. While Ino was not as vocal in her enmity as Chihiro, Kalen would never mistake Ino's calm for resignation. Fortunately, rivals had managed to find common ground by praising the Rising Sun's operations and asking for more details, effectively breaking the ice to the relief of everybody involved. After the rocky start, Ino and Rivals had gotten along surprisingly well. Ino was very interested in Rivals' motorcycle, his pride and joy, and had asked after its maintenance routine through Kalen. Rivals, for his part, had plenty of questions about the Rising Sun Association, which Ino had answered via half-truths and stories riddled with careful omissions. By the end of the meeting, Ino had felt comfortable enough to ask Rivals to bring friends with him next time he came to help with the Rising Sun. And at the next Friday night dinner, Rivals brought a friend with him in the sidecar of his motorcycle. Kalen continued, a friend who is also a member of the student council, so another valuable contact. But, well, Kalen floundered, trying to find the words to express just how creepy she found Lelouch Lamperouge. He's an oddball, that one. Even as she said it, Kalen winced. Oddball? Oddball? That was the best you could come up with? Damn it, Kalen. Very smart, but he just doesn't act right, you know? Like he's just going through the motions. All the girls at Ashford are head over heels for him, always talking about him, and I just don't get it. He always looks like he's acting, or something. At least to me. It was humiliating for Kalen to admit that Lelouch made her skin crawl. Judging by how skinny the boy's wrists were, Kalen had no doubt that she could break him over her knee like a green stick, splintering and all. He hadn't shown any overt hostility to her at school or at the handful of Rising Sun meetings he had attended. He had in fact been scrupulously polite whenever they met, if distant and a bit formal. But still, something about him just made a voice in the back of her head scream predator. Whenever they met. Think carefully, Kalen, urged Tanya, leaning over the table like a stooping hawk. When did you first feel uncomfortable around him? Was it tied to any inciting event? Is there any indication that he's gathering intelligence for a third party?
No, damn it, nothing like that.
That would be easy to explain. Kalen all but growled with exasperation, before taking a breath in a bid to calm herself back down. It's probably nothing, but something about him just gets under my skin. You should trust your instincts, Ogi noted, chiming back into the conversation from where he was leaning against the wall. Usually, there's a reason for why we feel the way we do, even if we can't quite consciously pin it down. If someone feels dangerous, probably best to treat them like they are until proven otherwise. Ogi's right about following your gut, Naoto agreed. Can't tell you how many times acting instinctively has saved my ass. You think that the Britannian hanging around rivals is a potential threat? You treat him like a threat until he proves otherwise. I'll keep that in mind, Kalen sighed, irritated at her own paranoid jumpiness as much as she was relieved that her concerns were being taken seriously. And I'll keep an eye on the guy. It's probably just me, but if he does show any signs of being some kind of spy, for his sake and our own, let's hope that he isn't. Tanya leaned back in her chair, her frown shifting into an irritated grimace. He's enrolled at a school for nobles, so he's presumably from a family with the means to pay Ash for tuition and the pull to get their son into the best school in the area. So, it seems unlikely that he'd be a spy or a police informant, at least in any sort of official capacity. If he was, I doubt his handlers would risk his noble neck by sending him out all alone. That said, a young and ambitious noble might have his own reasons for gathering sensitive information, agent of the state or not. Keep me informed, and like Ogi said, trust your instincts. Kalen nodded her agreement and Tanya waved at her to continue. That covers the basic details of my last few months at Ashford, Kalen concluded. Thanks to rivals, I've made a few more connections. I've continued to solidify my reputation with the student paper, and Millie's backed off a bit. Which brings me to my work out of school with the local papers. So, Kalen began, I had some success doing freelance work, submitting articles to several papers and magazines across the area. Mostly, I was just writing down and compiling society gossip I picked up at Ashford, but I also sold some articles about local news from the Tokyo settlement. And those local news articles actually got me a bit of a break in late January, I think. The editor of a local paper offered me an ongoing contract for an article a week on local news, with the option to publish more if they liked anything I sent in. Kalen grimaced, the small victory somewhat bitter in her mouth. I want to say that he really liked my work, but I think this was Diod Reed's influence more than anything else. The reporter? Well, at least he pays his debts, Tanya muttered after Kalen nodded in confirmation. It's still an achievement, quid pro quo or not. Congratulations on establishing a steady relationship with a publication, Kalen. It's not that impressive, Kalen demurred, flashing slightly at the praise. It's just a piecework deal, honestly. But I did manage to get a few articles that touched on more serious topics published in February, mostly about the new zoning allowing for industrial construction in some of the former honorary Britannian neighborhoods and the ongoing wage problem. I threw in some hand-wringing about the sudden rash of leveler graffiti all over the Tokyo settlement too, just to mix things up a bit so I didn't look too anti-administration. Tanya raised an eyebrow. Leveler? A banned Britannian political movement, Naoto explained. They've been outlawed for centuries, and probably don't exist anymore, but the nobility still hate and fear them. Not a huge surprise, since their whole platform is the redistribution of wealth and the abolition of social rank. Basically that, Kalen confirmed. Probably just some idiots with a can of paint or two. She carefully didn't remark on the way Tanya's face seemed to twist inwards on itself for a moment before the typical expressionless mask slammed back into place. What was that all about? Probably, Tanya agreed, although her calm tone sounded oddly forced in Kalen's ears. But idiots or not, it's interesting that the nobles would still be afraid of a long-dead band of political dissidents. That might indicate there's still something worth being concerned about, or it might mean that the fear of these levelers is serving some secondary purpose. Either way, Kalen continued with a non-committal shrug. The editor liked my articles enough to take a chance, so he published a 3-part series I'd written about the after effects of the Christmas incident. It helped that I didn't mention the incident directly, since the viceregal decree banning public mention of it is still in effect. I didn't get credited for any of the 3, but that might have been a blessing in disguise. I certainly think so, Tanya replied snappishly. That seems a bit overt,
Kalen. What did your articles say? Nothing to do with us.
Kalen hastily reassured her leader, but all the knock-on stuff, the waves that are hitting the Britannian bastards themselves. Seeing that Tanya wasn't reassured, Kalen took a breath and tried to summarize her mini-series. The first article was on the impact that so many small businesses going out of business all at once had on municipal taxes and property values. The second article was on the sudden unemployment of all the people who used to work at those businesses and the way they're not contributing to the local economy anymore since they don't have any money. Also, how they're now competing for jobs that are available, driving wages down. The third article was on the public health impacts of all the derelict buildings. Only 30% had been rebuilt by late March, and all of the damaged buildings that haven't been demolished yet are too dangerous to enter. Not to mention that some of them are full of rats and cockroaches, both of which are breeding like crazy. And, while I wasn't able to find any data about an uptick in hospital admissions, all that damaged plumbing has got to be draining somewhere, or it's just like how it was in Shinjuku, and there'll be a bunch of fetid pools as soon as the monsoon comes back. By the time she was nearly breathless and thankfully done speaking, her audience of 3 looked gratifyingly impressed.
That sounds like it took a bunch of work to write, Kalen.
Ogi praised.
Where did you get all of your information from?
Yes, I'm curious about how you sourced the data too, Tanya cut in. Also, what was the readership's reaction to your series? It sounds significantly different from the typical contents of a local newspaper, especially in an area governed by a dandy who can't stand criticism. Long story short,
I had some help, Kalen admitted.
One of the girls from the student paper apparently helps her father with his business taxes, and knew where I should look for current tax assessment data, which led me to the plot purchase information. The unemployment figures are publicly available, if probably somewhat inaccurate. The actual analysis, though? Well, I met this girl named Nina who is apparently some kind of super genius when it comes to mathematics. I asked her for help, and she just took my data and came back a day later with everything done and neatly typed up. The contrast between the very organized and detailed report and Nina's trembling hands as she held it up like an offering to Kalen had been very amusing. It had taken serious self-control on Kalen's part not to laugh at the shy girl when she'd handed over the thick folder holding her findings. Nina hadn't even made eye contact during the exchange. Every time she had tried, she just flushed and looked away, glasses sliding down the bridge of her nose. She was very helpful, and did it all for free. I even asked if she wanted a favor or something after she came back, but Kalen shrugged, baffled. She just squeaked and ran away when I offered. No clue what her deal is. Unfortunately, Kalen continued, ignoring the juvenile chuckling coming from Naoto and Ogi. While the initial publication was approved, whatever part of the administration manages the area's media later changed its mind. That day's edition got retracted from the official archives and the paper was issued an official warning. We either got lucky or someone bribed one of the officials, so that's all that happened, and I'm still welcome to submit articles to the paper just on different topics, since the editor made it clear that I'm on thin ice. Later retractions or not, it's interesting that the local media were willing to take the chance of official censure at all, Tanya mused, gazing off into the middle distance and rubbing her chin as she thought aloud. From what I've seen of most Britannian media, they seem very solicitous for official approval. On the other hand, considering Mr. Reed's eagerness to purchase your interview and photographs, there's clearly a demand for less sanitized content. Tanya's eyes snapped back to Kalen. Regardless, congratulations. It sounds like you wrote a very substantive series, and I am impressed that it saw the light of day for even a brief moment. I would love to read your articles myself when I get the opportunity. Before Kalen could stop blushing and stutter out her thanks, the tidal wave of praise rolled on. Overall, it sounds like you have been very hard at work, Kalen. You have continued to perform exceedingly well as our eyes and ears in the Britannian world, both as a student and as a journalist. That you've managed to find the time to continue making purchases for Rising Sun, to say nothing of actually helping out at the communal dinners outside of Shinjuku, is truly impressive. Tanya paused, and to Kalen's delight, smiled with pride at her. Well done, Kalen. Very well done. Aye. It's. Kalen swallowed, eyes glued on Tanya's as she tried to suppress her fervent desire to leap from her chair and dance around in celebration at the praise. Professional. You are a professional.
If you don't act professional, Tanya won't approve. It was nothing. I am proud to have contributed to the organization, and to the cause. A snort of laughter broke her concentration, and Kalen blushed anew as she realized that she had momentarily forgotten the two men in the room, both of whom were doing a poor job hiding laughter and sudden coughing fits. Well, you will have plenty of opportunities to contribute even more to the cause in the near future, Tanya replied, pausing to shoot a disdainful look at Ogi and Naoto, sobering the pair back up. We all will. Why do you say that, Tanya? Naoto asked, exhausted jocularity receding as his eyes suddenly came alert again. Is something about to happen? I believe so, Tanya replied, before grimacing again, but I don't know anything for certain. It's just a feeling that things are likely to get worse in Area 11 before they get better. Especially if the unemployment situation is as bad as Kalen is making it sound. Lots of idle men standing around, full to the brim with ethnic tensions. That's a recipe for civil unrest if I've ever heard one. Couple that with our friends in the JLF stirring the pot out in Niigata and Toyama. Kalen joined Naoto and Ogi in nodding along as Tanya continued to pontificate. If Clovis doesn't make a big move soon, he'll start to look ineffectual and powerless. He'll look weak, and no Britannian or politician can stand to look weak. If he doesn't look like he's able to hold the area together, the Viceroy will have to start worrying about palace coups, or potentially being replaced by a sibling from the homeland. After all, nothing can be allowed to endanger the flow of Sakuradite. Which means that Clovis has to make a move, and soon. Tanya's words hung heavily in the silence of the studio apartment. Kalen swallowed hard, trying not to let the sudden anxiety spiking in her gut slip into her voice. Sounds like we'll have a busy summer ahead of us, huh? Tanya smirked at that. Oh yes, very busy indeed. Luckily for you, Kalen, I've already got plans for you. Tell me, does Ashford have a summer break? If so, when does it start? Said Kalen eloquently, trying to remember the school calendar. I think the end of May? Maybe the first week of June? And then it goes through the end of August. Good. Tanya replied with a degree of enthusiasm Kalen found disquieting. I would have hated for you to miss any school. Education is very important, which is why I will be sending you to the school. Before Kalen could fully absorb that surprise, Tanya continued. I would have liked to send you as part of one of the training cohorts, but you have amassed enough unique skills in the human intelligence field that I can't afford to give you the luxury of a standard training pace. You have 3 months of summer, and I want you to spend at least 2 of them teaching our comrades everything you can about the art of collecting gossip, sorting out useful intelligence, social interrogation, and other topics. Even information about Britannian fashion or noble culture could be useful, and should be added to the institutional knowledge of the organization. But Tanya, Ogi interrupted, training at the school is supposed to last for 3 months, right? Kalen's not going to be able to get up to scratch in only a month, and you know Anoda's going to jump all over her and me if it looks like I'm showing a half-Britannian, and worse a half-Brit girl, any favoritism. Lucky for her, she'll have an instructor ready to give her personal attention for the next month before she has to leave, Tanya reposited, smirking at Ogi from her chair before turning back to Kalen. I know that, despite your skills as an intelligence gatherer and now as a journalist, you feel you are a warrior at heart, Kalen. Well, far be it from me to push you down a career track you don't want to follow. Tanya looked over at Naoto, before turning back to Kalen and continuing. You have proven yourself to me in the past. I remember your sterling performance in Shinjuku Gyome. That said, standards have evolved, and if you want to fight, you require further training. I know it's a significant ask, but I'm in. Kalen interrupted Tanya mid-sentence for the first time since they had sat on a dusty Shinjuku curb. Fuck no, you're not talking yourself or me out of the fight. I'm part of this, and, Kalen chuckled. Well, I saw the 2 gorillas you've got downstairs guarding this place, and I bet I could take either of them. No way your fancy school is that tough. I remember our training, and I've had tougher PE coaches. The goading worked. Tanya's eyes narrowed, even as Ogi began to laugh and Naoto snorted something that sounded suspiciously like cherry. Ha. Well then, Tanya began, voice silky with menace, let me tell you a bit more about the school, and what we'll have to do to get you ready to graduate with flying colors in a month so you'll be ready to start your teaching career. An hour later,
Kalen waved goodbye to the gorillas on guard as she made her way through the lobby of the apartment building. One of the pair, the one known to her as Train Spotter, had started to grin and wave back before freezing in place as Tanya trotted down the stairs behind her. It was almost irritating, the way Train Spotter's attention immediately shifted to the other girl, but Kalen was more interested in how different both men's bearings became the moment their commander walked into sight. Before Tanya had taken 2 steps into the lobby, both men had assumed some sort of military pose, heels together and rifles held across their chests. No hint of the casual sass Train Spotter had sent Kalen's way earlier was present. Both men's faces were stern and expressionless, their eyes glued to Tanya as she veered away from Kalen and towards the pair's position against a wall still pockmarked with vandalized postal boxes. More than the plans, the muscles, and the guns, the discipline on display was proof of everything Tanya had told Kalen about the school over the last hour. Kalen hadn't doubted anything her friend had told her, but when she had said that she was building an army in embryo, Kalen had put the emphasis on building. Judging by these 2 goons, I probably should have focused on the army part. She truly is making soldiers. Not that Kalen personally knew much of anything related to the army, but those stiff postures and attentive gazes looked plenty militaristic to her. After a few exchanges of muttered dialogue Kalen couldn't quite hear, both men nodded and in unison lifted the first 2 fingertips of their right hands to the outside of their eyebrows, holding the strange gesture until Tanya returned it a moment later. The exchange must have been some form of salute, Kalen realized, another example of the military culture Tanya had worked to instill into her trainees. The same example she'll be instilling into me, in a month's time. Well, it can't be any worse than learning noble etiquette after father came back. Turning on her heel, Tanya left the pair and returned to Kalen, the military stiffness bleeding away slightly but not leaving entirely. Kalen wondered if that stiffness, that slightly mechanical edge to her motions, had been a product of the school as well, or if it had always been there and Kalen was only noticing it after the months of separation. "What did you say to them?" Kalen asked as Tanya approached, curious what orders her friend the pint-sized general had issued. "I told them that their replacements would be coming in half an hour," Tanya replied, "and that as soon as Yoshi and his partner showed up, they could head over to the meeting house for a hot meal and a cot." Tsubaki reported in earlier and said she'd gotten temporary accommodations set up for the night. Kalen nodded. "Makes sense, I guess." She turned and started walking towards the lobby entrance as she continued talking. "I don't know if Big Bro's got any other buildings that big available, but you might want to ask. Just to keep your guys out of the way of the food handouts and all." "Ogi should already be discussing that with Naoto," Tanya replied, easily catching up to Kalen and falling into step with her. "After all, it would be best if our exact numbers were kept under wraps for now." As they exited the apartment building and made their way down the street, continuing to chat about less work-related topics, Kalen noticed Tanya starting to redden under her new tan. Which in and of itself was a bit strange, since it wasn't really that hot now that afternoon had practically given way to evening. Perhaps she's just used to cool mountain air and all that? But I thought Gunma was pretty hot in the summer too. Kalen suddenly realized that if Tanya had intended to head towards the association's meeting house to rendezvous with the rest of her unit, she had missed her turn. The road they had turned onto at the last intersection terminated at the nearest gate into Shinjuku, the one Kalen most often used when visiting the ghetto. She has been gone for 3 months, she might have forgotten. I'd better remind her. "Weren't you going to meet up with Ino to get some dinner? You probably should have taken the last left to get there." There was no mistaking the way Tanya's earlier pinkness darkened to a ruddy flush. "I thought I'd accompany you to the checkpoint, just to be safe." Impressively, Tanya managed to deliver the line without a hint of whatever emotion she was clearly suppressing entering her voice. Smiling, Kalen decided to let Tanya off the hook and accepted the younger girl's excuse. "Well, thanks. I'm pretty sure I'd be okay, and it looks like Naoto's got this area of Shinjuku on lockdown, but, well, you can never be too safe out here. Never know what could happen when you're alone." The last sentence had been a bit too sincere, and touched a bit too closely on an afternoon Kalen would rather forget, so she forced a laugh to lighten the mood back up as she cast around for an alternative topic. "Oh, that reminds me. Have you seen the new rising sun symbol?" "A new symbol?" Tanya enthusiastically leapt on the new topic, to Kalen's relief. "Did they move away from the light kanji? I thought it was perfectly serviceable." "Well,
No, Kalen admitted. But Ina tells me that Ina got all pissed that people weren't drawing it right, so she started making stencils and handing them out to people to mark territory. Then, someone expanded on it, and now, there's one. Kalen pointed at a nearby wall. 2 concentric circles and the light in the center. It's certainly eye-catching, Tanya mused, walking over and peering at the red and yellow sigil with a critical eye. The concentric circles are a nice touch. They draw the viewer's gaze into the character. Kalen shrugged. If you say so. I was never much for art anyway, but yeah, that's probably the point. A few seconds later, Tanya seemed to lose interest in the symbol and rejoined Kalen as she continued on her way. My stepmother was always very annoyed that I couldn't do anything ladylike, embroidery and the like. For some reason Kalen couldn't fathom. A look of pure sympathy shot across Tanya's face. Almost more startlingly, the usually subdued Tanya made no attempt to disguise her emotions, and instead further broke character by reaching out and patting Kalen on the arm. Kalen nearly tripped over her own feet in surprise. Holy shit. I don't think I've ever seen Tanya initiate physical contact before. Someone's always got to reach out to her, and she usually pretends to hate it. Kalen replayed the last few sentences in her mind, trying to figure out what her friend had so obviously resonated with. Guess you're not very artistic either, eh? Tanya hummed non-committally. I wouldn't know, I haven't attempted anything I'd call art in years. But I have experience with people trying to force me into roles that didn't fit me. A slight, nostalgic smile worked its way across Tanya's face. Would you believe it, it wasn't too different from your own experience, in a peculiar way. The reference, if that's what the cryptic comment had been, was lost on Kalen. Based on Tanya's own words and the information Ogi and Naoto had shared with her, Tanya's mother had been a low-ranking prostitute catering to Britannian soldiers and sailors as well as Japanese laborers, before she'd been beaten to death. Tanya's education hadn't extended past elementary school, barring the month she'd spent enrolled in the Shinjuku school for 11s. Try as she might, Kalen couldn't figure out when some fool would have attempted to force etiquette lessons onto Hajime Tanya. I'm thinking too narrowly. Forced into a role I didn't fit doesn't just mean nobility. Maybe she means the school for 11s? Or maybe. Kalen forced the disgusting thought from her mind with a shudder. No, Ogi said she obviously mourned her mother. That's impossible. It's gotta be the half-assed indoctrination. Guess we really don't play by the rules, do we, Tanya? Kalen half-joked, giving Tanya an out from the potentially fraught conversation requests for further details might provoke. The smile slipped away from Tanya's face, and a pensive frown took its place. For a long moment, the blonde didn't answer, only trudging along in silence. Kalen walked on by her side, hoping she hadn't said something wrong, though she couldn't see how her statement would offend her friend. We're both part of an insurgency, Tanya's the leader, for God's sake. We're well beyond playing by the rules. I suppose not. Tanya's tone of voice sounded more like she was admitting to some deep transgression than agreeing with a simple statement of fact. It was clear to Kalen that they'd somehow moved away from the banal conversation she'd thought they were having. It's strange, Kalen. I value order, I value rules, and I value organization, but... And suddenly, Tanya was facing Kalen, looking straight into her eyes. The nearly empty street, its small shops all closed for the day, vanished into irrelevance compared to the blonde's sudden fervor. But this order, the word was spat out as if it were rotten, isn't rule-abiding. If there is a social contract, it's that the strong devour the weak and are applauded for doing so. The law is simply the gilding on the blunt instrument of military power used to force submission. This is a perversion of order. It's order without rules, order as a tool for exploitation, all for the benefit of those at the top of the heap. Then, mercurial as she sometimes was during intense moments, Tanya's fiery passion suddenly banked. Even as it cooled, the intense heat seemed to somehow solidify in the spring air. Somehow, Kalen was sure that her fellow Hafu, her best friend and the secret master of the rising sun, had reaffirmed her commitment to the cause all over again. An impression that was strengthened by the muttered coda to the rant, spoken just loud enough for Kalen to hear, less than half a meter away. It's wrong, Kalen. The inefficiency, the corruption, the sheer waste. It's wrong.
It's all wrong. Spellbound by that arresting gaze, full of passion and girded in a certainty of conviction, Kalen unconsciously slipped into reporter mode.
And what would you do to fix all this, Tanya? What's your first step? Look around you.
Tanya gestured at the placid apartment buildings around them, all adorned with signs advertising the unofficial businesses operating on the ground floors.
We've already taken our first steps here in Shinjuku.
Order where the stakeholders have direct access to the leadership and input on the decisions that affect us all. Tangible benefits for everybody who cooperates towards our goals. A place where the hungry can trade a day's labor for a full belly. Where orphans won't have to break their backs for starvation rations, sacrificing their futures a day at a time for an eternal present.
Tanya bared her teeth in a grin lacking in amusement. Not a bad start, eh? But just a start.
Before Kalen could ask her next question, the crackle of a radio transmission burst from Tanya's backpack, surprising both Kalen and Tanya, judging by the latter's comedically wide eyes. In a motion lacking the blonde's usual finesse, Tanya swung the old backpack around and hastily riffled through the contents before retrieving a handheld radio that matched the one Kalen had seen in Trainspotter's hands earlier that afternoon.
Backpack here. Say again. Over.
The radio chirped as Tanya released the transmit button, the sound oddly cheerful against the backdrop of the lengthening evening shadows. Despite her curiosity, Kalen kept quiet. Tanya probably had no idea what her people wanted either, and distracting her wouldn't make the reply come any sooner. Fortunately, neither rebel had to wait long for a reply. Bought a backpack. There's a man heading straight towards you and Cherry. Mallet and I have eyes on him, but haven't approached him yet. Do you know about him? Over. A pistol appeared in Tanya's free hand halfway through the transmission, and the knife sprang out from Kalen's compact only a second later. Backpack to bore, that's not one of ours. Switch to general chat. Do you copy? As Tanya spoke, she gestured towards an alley, and with a nod Kalen darted inside and quickly checked for lurkers even as the crackling continued behind her. Finding the alley empty except for the acrid tang of urine, Kalen waved to Tanya, who walked backwards into the alley and twisted a dial on her handset before continuing to speak. Backpack to ferret. Boar found a potential hostile inbound on Cherry and I have Boar and Mallet checked to make sure he doesn't have any backup. If he does, get a count. Password to Train Spotter and Boxcar. Have them and their squads hustle over. If he's alone, have Boar and Mallet bag him and bring him to me. Do you copy? Most of the lazy fools who called themselves journalists ambled through life, hoping to trip over a story worthy of publication. Diod Reed scorned such journalists as the bottom feeders they were. A truly great reporter, like a certain humble producer for High TV, went out into the world to find the story, following leads wherever they may go, no matter the danger to life or limb. The story was the only thing that really mattered, at least in the long view. Long after everybody had forgotten the bard's name, the song he had sung would live on. To be the one to tell such a tale, one that will live forever, especially from first-person experience. Anything is worth that. Anything. Years of stifling mediocrity had almost crushed the dream. Endless weeks and days producing tired old features with slight variations, all with the same characters and in the service of the same banal message, had almost stripped Diod of his hopes for transitory immortality. His existence was comfortable. In Area 11, a Britannian pound went pretty far, and he had no shortage of money, but overwhelmingly and depressingly bland. An endless expanse of grey days, without a single story truly worthy of his talents as a storyteller and as a producer, had stretched out before him. And then, Christmas had come, both for Diod and for the Tokyo settlement. Overnight, tensions that had been bubbling for years had mixed with alcohol and exploded into an orgy of violence. The night of arson and murder reignited a spark of interest in his empty existence. As fires raged out of control and iron rods and leather boots descended on pleading faces and pulped ribs, Diod had scrambled for a camera crew and a van. To his disgust, by the time he'd finally gotten the lazy bastards roused in the van on the road, all the major roads had been blocked off by soldiers. Worse yet, the Viceroy's office had been unexpectedly on top of events, banning all coverage of the events of the previous night except when permitted by viceregal decree. It had almost been enough to quash that small spark entirely. But then by some stroke of fortune, just as he was contemplating throwing in the towel entirely, Kalen Kardimant had walked right up to him in the parking lot of Nunnally Memorial and brazenly thrown tinder onto that guttering flame. Truthfully, Diod hadn't expected much when he began looking in on the young Lady Stadtfeld. His curiosity had been piqued by the student reporter who had seemingly effortlessly stolen an interview out from under the noses of a hospital full of soldiers, particularly since she had tried, badly, to hide her name. That said, he expected to find little of note, just a student rebelling against her parents, a so-called tea-house revolutionary. In a strange way, his initial expectations had been right on the money. The girl was indeed rebelling against her father and his new wife, but that was ancillary to the real meat of the story. Lady Kalen Stadtfeld, as the heiress of House Stadtfeld and all of its titles, properties, and holdings, was one of the most eligible bachelorettes in the area. Despite this lofty status, little was known about the girl. She hadn't been seen at any prominent social events, and as far as Diod could tell, had no suitors. Considering the presumed wealth of a family like the Stadtfelds, that was strange to say the least. And so, Diod had dug deeper into the mystery of Kalen Stadtfeld, and soon found the missing pieces of the puzzle. Kalen Stadtfeld might be the Stadtfeld heiress now, recognized by her father, but that hadn't always been the case. Bastardry wasn't unheard of, especially not when the father in question was getting on in years like the current Lord Stadtfeld, but miscegenating with a number was another thing entirely. Admittedly, many noblemen, and even some noble ladies, had illegitimate offspring with numbers, but recognizing a half number as a legitimate heir was intriguing. Almost as intriguing as the other missing piece. Nathaniel Stadtfeld, also known as Kozuki Naoto, had been born on the wrong side of the sheets, just like his sister. Unlike his sister, the man was obviously of mixed heritage, judging by the mugshot Diod had found. The sealed police record, somehow misfiled as a juvenile file despite Kozuki's age, no doubt thanks to his sire's money, had been interesting reading. The assault charges, a few with a deadly weapon and 2 elevated to grievous bodily harm, had been the highlights. It was obvious to Diod why Nathaniel hadn't been legitimized, passed over in favor of his sister. A sordid tale, but nothing spectacular. He'd seen similar stories time and again, and while it would no doubt be prime content for gossip-mongering rags, Diod wasn't interested in such petty publications. At least, not while I'm off the clock. The interesting part was that the younger sister, chosen over her elder brother and elevated into pure Britannian respectability, was obviously obsessed with her secret number heritage. It was unthinkable, and thus absolutely titillating. Diod absolutely had to know more, had to know everything. Every hard-won newsroom instinct was screaming at him to continue his private investigation, and so he did. Her articles, even published without a credit and with his behind-the-scenes assistance, had so much written between the lines that the actual content was almost obscured. Her slip-up at that peculiar charities meeting, caught on the microphone of a hidden camera, one of many scattered about the city by the more clandestine yet still incompetent parts of the viceregal administration, had been telling. Which brought him to the charity itself. The Rising Sun Benevolent Association had mysteriously appeared several months earlier, seemingly springing up from nowhere with plentiful funding and noble backing with the mission to provide opportunities to the people of Area 11. It hadn't escaped Diod's notice that the sponsoring noble was a Mr. Rivals Kardimant, nor had it been difficult to identify the young lady who had submitted the forms with the young Kardimant's signature affixed at the Division of Public Records and Licenses. It was clear to Diod that the Rising Sun was Kalen's tool. What she intended to do with said tool, though, was a bit of a puzzle. Attempting to uplift Elevens wasn't going to improve her situation, and might actually reduce her standing in noble society, potentially weakening House Stadtfeld. But, if the association wasn't a charity, what were the industrious Elevens up to? The sheer number of Rising Sun trucks passing in and out of the Shinjuku ghetto made Diod think of smuggling, but he couldn't find any connections to any exterior networks, making it unlikely that the Rising Sun was trafficking drugs or weapons. Understanding had come, as it so often did to the most skilled journalist in Area 11, like a bolt from the blue. Kalen Stadtfeld's actions made no sense when considered from the point of view of a Britannian lady trying to improve her position. On the other hand, those actions made plenty of sense when Kalen Stadtfeld was ignored in favor of Kozuki Kalen. Clearly, Lord Stadtfeld had underestimated the love a little sister could have for her big brother, a love so intense, and possibly perverse, depending on how Diod chose to spin the story, that she chose to form a criminal organization with the sole intent of installing her brother in the position of power he had been denied by their father. Diod could see it all so clearly, but he knew that reporters' intuition wouldn't be quite enough to bring the majority of the audience along with him to the seemingly obvious conclusion. He needed something to seal the deal, some piece of evidence so flagrant that nobody could doubt his undeniable narrative. He had waited patiently for his moment. He knew it would come. It would have been unfair for the world to have given him all but the last piece of the story, after all, and it eventually had when Kalen had suddenly run off into Shinjuku Ghetto herself. As soon as Diod could, he left work and made his way to the checkpoint outside of Shinjuku Ghetto. He strode through the gates alone, a small portable video camera and a microphone tucked away in his jacket, along with his personal portable drive, the one containing all of the unredacted copies of his articles as well as his private projects. Everything in life was, after all, up for sale, provided you had the right coin to pay the asking price. And while Diod lacked weapons or cash, any rebel worthy of the name would understand the value of information. Even if the rebel in question was an overly emotional schoolgirl. Immediately after passing through the checkpoint, 3 roads branched out before Diod, one heading left, another right, and the other straight into the heart of the ghetto. Without missing a beat, Diod marched straight down the central boulevard, if such a term could be applied to any Shinjuku thoroughfare, humming a jaunty tune as he went. The throng of 11s parted before him with barely a murmur. Despite the crowd, Diod walked in a tiny bubble of isolation. Even though he knew it was only the beaten numbers' fear of their Britannian masters, Diod found the experience pleasant. I wonder if this is what it feels like to be a royal. Discarding the distracting thought, Diod noticed a figure detach itself from one of the knots of young toughs loitering on a nearby corner before pelting off down the same way he was going. Notably, the headbands that the lean band of teens wore bore a striking resemblance to the symbol painted on the signs announcing the Rising Sun charity dinners in the honorary Britannian refugee centers. Diod smiled. He had barely taken a dozen steps into the ghetto, and another lead had all but fallen into his hands. No doubt that fool's off to tell his boss all about me. I'll have to thank him for providing directions straight to the Kozukis. Unhurriedly strolling after the runner, Diod took the time to look around as he gave his prospective subject time to prepare for their upcoming appointment. This was far from the first time that Diod had sought out dangerous and desperate people for interviews, and he'd learned that springing a surprise interview wasn't always the best idea. While surprised subjects sometimes blurted out answers with less consideration than they typically have, it was far more likely that they would simply ignore any questions in favor of fleeing or fighting. Giving the subject enough warning to compose themselves but not enough to escape him entirely was the better tactic, in Diod's experience. As a result, he was entirely unsurprised when 2 burly 11s stepped out of a side street and into the middle of the road a block ahead. Clearly, neither had any intention of giving way to his advance like the rest of the crowd. Indeed, the pair were approaching him at a brisk pace. Fortunately, being the best newsman in Area 11, Diod had prepared for just such an eventuality. Wadashi uanatano wa kai ridane surete at tiku dasayat had taken some work with an 11 to Britannian dictionary a decade old, but hopefully he just told the welcoming party to take him to their young mistress. It was difficult, using a language he was manifestly unfamiliar with, but he hoped he'd manage to convey the proper mixture of stern demand and dutiful respect. The thin man whose large nose bore the signs of multiple past breaks blinked and turned towards his companion, but the more portly of the two just continued forwards. Broken Nose shrugged, pulled a handset off his belt and muttered something before following his partner. That damn dictionary was worthless. By this point in his career, Diod was unfortunately quite familiar with how this particular interaction would play out. He didn't mind the handful of bruises and cuts he'd likely be sporting soon. Suffering was the fuel for grand art, after all, but his suit was another matter entirely. The two-piece was cashmere, the cravat was silk, and his dress shirt was 160 thread count cotton. Sadly, the two 11 thugs looked entirely ignorant of the finer things in life, especially haute couture. Judging by their grimy and worn rags and tags, the pair would likely rip the jacket off his back to get better access to his ribs. Caught between a Scylla and a Charybdis, Diod could only see one path forwards towards his goal.
By the time the two goons had closed the distance, his jacket and cravat were draped across his arm and the first two buttons of his dress shirt were undone. The jacket hung heavily, the camera and microphone still tucked away in the inner pockets. Diod hadn't thought he could smuggle them past the guards, and any attempt to do so would be harshly punished. His personal drive, on the other hand, was squirreled away in the pocket of his trousers. Hopefully handing over the recording equipment will convince Fatso and Broken Nose that I'm playing along. As Broken Nose, the slightly quicker of the two goons, reached for his arm, Diod casually handed over his jacket. The man's hand instinctually closed on the bundle of fabric and his eyes widened slightly, presumably at the slight though unexpected weight. Diod nodded affably at the man, as if he'd simply handed over his coat to a butler at some noble mansion, before spreading his arms wide with his palms open. If they see I'm not resisting, hopefully the beating will be over sooner. To Diod's surprise, the beating never came. The two numbers were just as unwashed as he'd first thought, but they clearly were professionals of some stripe or another. Amusingly enough for Diod, this latest detainment by Savage Elevens was actually one of the more civilized arrests he had endured, as well as one of the more professional. True, they were halfway carrying him down the street, but neither had administered a preemptive love tap to the kidneys, like most of the bully boys the various nobles kept on retainer. And that's not even getting into the thugs that bastard Kenway sent after I started asking about his wife's mistress. A minute later, Diod found himself kneeling on asphalt beside a remarkably clean gutter, staring up into the barrel of a gun. Although the trip downward had been surprisingly gentle, neither of the two men had helped him fall face first into the pavement. After all, Diod still winced at the thought of the tar and street grit marring his expensive suit trousers. These pants are ruined for sure. The things I do for an interview. Anybody else, Diod was sure, would be concerned about the gun a foot from his nose, but Diod was more interested in the child wielding that gun. Not as much as he was about the delicate cashmere fibers of his suit pants, but it wasn't every day that he was menaced by a girl who couldn't even truly be called a teenager. Bet she'll be a real beauty once she grows up, assuming she doesn't scowl like that all the time. Besides his confidence in his own destiny, Diod had no difficulty keeping his cool for another reason, threatening little Poppet or not. He had graduated from the Imperial University of Colchester, and knew every journalistic trick backwards and forwards. He'd used those skills to extract stories from the shifty, the recalcitrant, and the willfully obstructive numerous times before. This would hardly be his first hostile interview. Journalism was no trade for the easily riled, and Diod had long since mastered the art of dramatic nonchalance. Admittedly, this was the first time he had ever interviewed a subject at gunpoint, but that was easy to dismiss. While he had no doubt that the tween menacing his perfect face would pull the trigger if he so much as twitched, it didn't really matter. He would get Kalen Stadtfeld's story and tell it one day. He couldn't die until he'd told that grand tale. It simply wasn't an option. Though the longer Diod looked into the young blonde's eyes, the more difficult it was to remain confident in his control of the situation. Even though he knew in his bones that it wasn't his time to die, not when he had yet to see his name added to the pantheon of great storytellers, those cold eyes promised nothing but a short trip to the grave. Diod had been the indifferent recipient of many hostile looks, and plenty of people had tried to intimidate him for one reason or another. Irate nobles had glared with imperious disdain down their noses at his questioning, armored in privilege. Angry producers had fumed across boardrooms and offices, spewing forth threats to have him fired in their frustration. Any number of thugs and criminals had tried to scare him with mean looks, enough that Diod had grown bored. But now, I feel sweat rolling down my back. What the hell is up with this kid? That was actually a good question. With some effort, Diod forced himself to break eye contact with the pint-sized menace in front of him, and took a look at his would-be executioner. No hint of baby fat or roundness was present in her face, which seemed built out of sharp edges with only a handful of curves to soften the angles. Great cheekbones, though. She might have had potential as a model. The battered old child's backpack dangling off one of her shoulders underlined her youth, as did the messy flyaway hair. Still, she looks like she knows what she's doing with that gun. Drawing on every day of his near decade of Fourth Estate experience, Diod summoned up his second-best producer's smile and attempted to break the ice. I was right, wasn't I? There's definitely a story here. To Diod's irritation,
The young pistolero ignored him entirely, and instead turned her head slightly back and said something in Japanese. A moment later, a lighter voice replied in the same language, and Kalen Stadtfeld, heiress to the House of Stadtfeld, the barony of New Leicester, and much more excitingly, the founder of the Rising Sun Association, stepped out into the day's waning light. Gun at his head or not, about to conduct undoubtedly the most crucial interview of his life, Diod still couldn't help himself from needling his subject. Doing some investigative reporting live from Shinjuku, Kalen Kardimund? Or, should I say, Lady Kalen Stadtfeld? Oh, but you're playing the role of an 11 freedom fighter, so it must be Kozuki Kalen at the moment, yes? To her credit, the redhead tried to conceal her shock, but Diod was an old hand when it came to picking up tells. Her eyes had flared open with surprise for just over a second, and her stoic mask cracked for about the same length of time, but that momentary lapse spoke delicious volumes. Disappointingly, the errant noble reacted just as Diod had expected she would when he finally showed his cards. Anger flashed across her face, and the knife that Diod hadn't even noticed in her hand was almost instantly an inch in front of his left eye. Tell me why I shouldn't kill you right now. The anger was still there, a powerful undercurrent in her voice, but her tone was calm and collected. So she can still control her anger, just like in December, eh? Good to see I haven't wasted my time. Besides the fact that you don't know how I found out about your alternate persona? You're surprisingly easy to track down, Lady Stadtfeld, Diod replied airily. You should probably work on that. After all, I doubt the DSS would be as interested as I am in seeing your story arc through to the end. Luckily for you, I have the skills to help you reach that happy conclusion and am willing to help. Thank you for your kind offer, Mr. Reed. The undercurrent throbbed, but the calm exterior shell was still holding, if barely. Glad to see you're still just as willing as always to help a young reporter out. You held up your end of our deal the last time, which was a huge surprise, but I don't think I want anything else to do with you. But, since you helped me out before, I'll make it quick. And probably painless. Probably. As the young Stadtfeld continued to speak, the angry pulse faded before disappearing entirely, leaving only calm certainty behind. That worried Diod a great deal. In his experience, if someone needed to talk themselves up to an angry froth, it was equally easy to talk them back down to a more reasonable frame of mind. Kalen's dispassion, on the other hand, had an immovable quality. A large drop of sweat rolled down his spine, all the way from his shoulders to his waist. From less than an inch away, that knife looked quite sturdy and extremely sharp. Considering the slim but visible muscles on Kozuki Kalen's arm, Diod had no doubt that the instrument would easily smash through his sphenoid and into his brain. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Before his lunatic main character could give him an amateur lobotomy, that steely-eyed angel of a blonde interrupted. Kalen, hold. Diod resisted the urge to blink in surprise at the accented Britannian. He'd probably have a nasty cut on his eyelid if he did. Can't jolly well be TV ready with half an eyelid. Not unless I grew out my bangs, perhaps. Oh, she's still talking. Diod Reed, his enigmatic savior, was saying, of high TV, if I remember correctly. What are you doing in Shinjuku Ghetto? Why are you following us? And how did you know about my associates' names? Her accent's strange. Now that his life wasn't immediately in danger, Diod took a second, longer look at the nameless blonde. On second look, the girl looked older than the 12 Diod had initially pegged her as. Although he doubted she'd lived much longer than a decade, the hand not busy shoving a pistol in his face was thick with calluses, the fingernails grey with ingrained dirt, and her arms. Geez, I don't remember being that muscular as a kid. From his knee-bound position, it was clear that her hair was blonde to the roots, and her eyes were wide, expressive, and only slightly almond in shape. Definitely not Japanese, despite her fluency, but that accent's not Britannian. Is Stadtfeld consorting with foreigners too? A European? Or, a European 11 half-breed? Either way, you're pretty far from home, aren't you? You seem to know me, but I don't believe we've met. With a slight flourish, Diod donned his charming but non-seductive smile, a classic when impressing children and married women alike. I'm aware. The tone was just as stern and unimpressed as before. Knowing a losing proposition when he saw one, Diod let the smile slip from his face in favor of a more businesslike mask.
I was enjoying a pleasant walk with my companion, and I have a busy itinerary this evening. Do not keep me waiting any longer. All business, eh? Well, I can play that role too. Well, I'm glad someone's actually asking the important questions. I was intrigued by the young Miss's ability to get such an emotional and explosive interview on the events of the Christmas riots from a protected source, as well as by her canny decision to secretly record the interview, making it difficult to dismiss as false. After she took my offer and started doing stringer work, writing on subjects uncomfortable for the area's administration no less, I decided to find out who she really was in my free time, as a personal project. Diod spoke quickly, doing his best to be as detailed as possible, conscious that he remained very literally under the gun. Despite, or perhaps because of the added pressure, he felt remarkably alive, and allowed himself a proud smile as he described his efforts. Even though it had been a simple investigation by his standards, he had apparently beaten Clovis's security services to the punch while working in his spare time. It wasn't hard, there aren't that many schools in Area 11, and enrollment records are easily accessed for a small expense. Only 2 schools had a Cardimund on the rolls, and neither had a Kalen Cardimund. However, one of those schools did have a Kalen enrolled. So then what? Kalen interrupted, clearly offended. Did you just sit in a van outside Ashford all day, waiting to see if I'd show up? Thankfully, she'd moved the knife away from his eye while Diod had been speaking with the possible European, so he could allow himself a single smug chuckle. Absolutely not, Lady Stadtfeld. That's what the interns are for, Diod laughed, keeping an eye on the volatile noble as he continued. No, I just accessed a little back door in the Tokyo settlement's surveillance systems I happen to know about. Clovis really should vet his staff far more carefully. Diod shrugged, an artfully careless gesture carefully refined to be both classy and aggravating. I only had to watch an hour of sped-up recordings to find you, Lady Stadtfeld. Your hair makes you incredibly distinctive. Diod felt his lips curving up into a smirk, but couldn't stop the impulse. It just felt so good to really show off without having to hold back in the slightest. You might want to work on that as well. Save the commentary for later and answer my questions. The blonde gestured with the pistol, as if to remind Diod that he was still a finger's pull away from death. Diod nodded, duly chastised. Tell the story first, interpreted later. I'm doing educational programming right now. I kept an eye on her activities after that. On the surface, nothing looked too interesting, silly schoolgirl politics and charity work. The articles she was writing were much more though, subtly keeping the imitation Britannians in the news, bringing up the meat and potato issues, including the lack of little meat and potatoes. Slowly moving only his head, Diod turned slightly away from the still nameless girl and smiled up at Kalen, deliberately injecting just a hint of paternal pride into the expression. And yes, I did read your series on the economic impacts of that little bit of unpleasantness. Lots of just asking the questions and dropping uncomfortable facts into the eyes of the readers, all without mentioning Clovis or the incident by name. Very well done. Thanks, the ungrateful brat replied with every drop of youthful sarcasm she could muster. Your approval means the world to me. Are you going to get to the point anytime soon? You should be taking notes on this, Kalen. Diod replied, unperturbed by the teenaged petulance. It was, after all, a welcome change from the deadly cool killer who had almost carved out his eye. Give your audience a hook, give them a nice dramatic background, make them hungry for the big reveal and keep them dancing on the line until it's time to reel them in. He smirked again. I really need to work on improving control over my expressions. I've gotten complacent. Don't worry, you're still a student, so some impatience is understandable. A muscle twitched on Kalen's forehead, but to Diod's fascination she just took a deep breath, held it for a second, and released it. He's playing for time now, I think, she said to her friend, the cool certainty bleeding back into her voice as she spoke. Let me just kill him now, and we can put the leftovers in the alley. Not yet, came the reply in accented Britannian. Central European, maybe? The accent's definitely not Mediterranean or French. Mr. Reed, you have 1 minute. Fine. Diod very carefully didn't pout, though he dearly wanted to. Here he was trying to tell a story, and his audience kept rushing the narrative. I've got enough evidence to say that Kalen Stadtfeld is definitely an 11 sympathizer, but that's not very interesting. There's lots of dumb bleeding heart noble kids around, but they mostly grow out of it. Do a little graffiti, 1 or 2 fundraisers, and then they move on. You, though, Kalen. I knew you were different. Kalen was his main character, and also, Diod felt, the audience he needed to win over here and now to see tomorrow. Taking a chance, Diod focused solely on the noble teenager, ignoring the younger girl with the gun just as thoroughly as he was ignoring the 2 thugs behind him. The fact that we're here in the 11 Ghetto, Japanese. The tone brooked no defiance. Diod choked down his irritation at being interrupted and continued. Japanese Ghetto and not the concession proves just how different you are. What other noble numbers fan would come to the Ghetto? None of them. Admittedly, a few of them are probably on good terms with their bastard siblings too, but even still, I knew you were different. I knew you were special. And Diod shrugged, trying to act nonchalant despite the dangerous level of sincerity in his words. I was bored. I mean, I still needed evidence that you were truly up to something beyond the normal bullshit, but to be brutally honest, Kalen, I'm bored. I'm tired of producing endless propaganda puff pieces, tired of telling the same old stories of progress and profit, tired of the whole sham. Diod suddenly realized that he had lost control over his mouth. This must be inspiration. I've finally got a true story to tell, and this is the first crux. I became a reporter to find stories, drag them out into the light, and tell them. That's my raison d'etre, my entire purpose. I want to see history play out before my very eyes, and be the one to tell the world what happened. And you are making history. You have all the makings of a great character. Heirs with a secret heritage, torn between 2 peoples and siding with the weaker against the greater in a noble fight? All to restore the birthright of your beloved sibling? That's the kind of story that will capture hearts. Mothers will one day tell it to their children. Your name will be a byword for loyalty, and you'll be immortal in the pages of history. Panting, Diod came to a shuddering halt. Kalen was looking down on him with an expression halfway between confusion and disbelief, while the blonde, 20 seconds left, Mr. Reed, was somehow looming over him despite being only slightly taller standing up than he was kneeling. At least she's smiling. She looks amused. Is that a good sign? It must be. I want to tell a grand story. Your story. Diod realized that he was looking at the blonde, and shook himself. Not your main character, Reed, nor your audience. Turning back to Kalen, Diod continued with his pitch. If I wanted to hurt you, I would have already handed over my data to JSS. I didn't, nor did I tell anybody where I was going tonight. Someone will probably find my van parked outside the Ghetto sooner or later, but that's it. Hopefully that reassures her that I'm not trying to extort her. And now, to buy my way in. And I brought a gift. I've got a portable drive in my pocket filled with the unredacted, uncensored versions of every article I've written and story I've produced. It's also got all of the gossip I have on the local notables, including Prince Clovis. Plus, all the information I've gathered on you, your organization, and your brother. Just. Diod hated the weak, wheedling note that had entered his voice, but this was it, the doorway into his lifelong dream, or at least a situation where the dream might come to pass. Just, please, let me be there. Let me see what happens. Put me to work. Use me. Just let me be the one to tell the story when everything's said and done. Suddenly, Diod sagged, spent after his revelatory climax. After a moment, he looked up, hoping to gauge his audience's response. To his mild dismay, it was a decidedly mixed bag. Kalen looked slightly stunned, blinking as she tried to make sense with his passion. I can't blame her. Most teenagers can't fathom acting with the eyes of history upon them. Less gratifyingly, the European girl was frowning down at him with disdain. So that's it. Diod's doubts evaporated like snow under the summer sun. Can't win them all, Reed. A loudmouth so desperate for recognition and immortality that he seeks it out vicariously, and a fool willing to throw aside a respectable and well-compensated position on a whim after following a girl around for months without speaking to her once. It's always difficult to trust traitors, even if they do have a good reason for their betrayal. False once will be false again, after all, and you lack even a fig leaf of justification. I have no doubt you'd betray anybody to further your ambition. It was a struggle, but Diod kept a smile on his face as the still unnamed blonde harangued him, waiting for a moment to get a word in edgewise. It turned out that he didn't need to.
That said, someone with access to the higher strata of Britannian society and to the resources an established member of a major TV station has at their fingertips would be a useful tool indeed. Wait, Tanya, no way. Suddenly, Diod was struggling not to laugh as the half-breed noble blurted out her almost certainly European friend's name. So much for that air of professionalism. You're really thinking of letting him live? You said it yourself, there's no way we can trust him. On the contrary, I think we can trust him to act according to his nature. As I said, he'd betray anybody if it served his ambition. So long as his goals are at least parallel to ours, he's only a potential liability. The blonde, Tanya, riposted, before unbelievably holstering her gun. Diod felt his pulse race at the prospect that he might escape this situation alive. I knew it. I knew it couldn't end here. Everything's up for sale, Kalen. Not just with money, that's the most common currency, not the only one, but with all kinds of things. Friendship, a favor, a cause, or the fulfillment of a personal ambition or a dream. Everybody has a price, you just need to figure out what currency must be tendered, and if you can afford to pay. The cold eyes were upon him once more, and Diod felt like a mouse caught in the gaze of a cobra. Did I fall for a decoy protagonist? Mr. Reed, I think that you and I can help each other out. I think you know what coin I expect from you, and I know exactly what you're looking for from me. What say we enter into a mutually beneficial contract, like civilized people do? Suddenly, the gun was back in her hand. If you'd prefer not to engage in trade and barter, well, there's always room in the alley. Diod only caught the wicked smile that briefly flashed across the girl's face because he was staring straight at her. It was gone in a second, like a bolt from the blue. Call this an offer you can't refuse.